Imagine, for a moment, the queen at the end of a long day. She sits in her private chamber, the noise of the great hall fading into silence. Her ladies gently remove the heavy crown, the velvet cloak, the jeweled adornments. The flicker of a single candle lights her face, revealing not just a figure of majesty, but a woman who carries the weight of her world with poise. She thinks of her children, her husband, her homeland, and the uncertain future. She closes her eyes, whispering a prayer that tomorrow will bring peace, and that her efforts will secure stability for those who depend on her. Queens lived lives marked by grandeur, but also by sacrifice. They were symbols of unity, instruments of politics, and guardians of family. Their power was rarely loud or celebrated, but it was enduring, woven into the decisions, alliances, and traditions that shaped medieval Europe. To understand queens is to understand the quiet strength that kept kingdoms steady, even in times of chaos. So as you drift into rest, let your mind wander through the candlelit chambers of a medieval queen. Picture the soft rustle of gowns, the echo of footsteps in stone corridors, the murmur of prayers whispered at dawn. These queens of old may seem distant, yet their lives remind us of the enduring power of influence, gentle, steady, and timeless. For a medieval king, religion was not merely a personal matter of faith. It was the very foundation upon which his authority rested, the guiding force that shaped his duties, and the unshakable framework through which his people understood the world. In an age when heaven and earth were thought to be inseparably linked, a king was not just a ruler. He was God's chosen servant, anointed to govern with divine sanction. The coronation ceremony itself reflected this sacred role. It was not simply a political act, but a holy rite performed within the hallowed walls of a cathedral. The king knelt before the altar, received the blessing of bishops, and was anointed with holy oil, much like the priests who served at the altar. This ritual symbolized that his power did not come from men, but from God. To his subjects, the king was not only a monarch, but a living link between heaven and earth. Religion guided every stage of a king's life, from the prayers whispered over him at birth to the solemn chants at his funeral. Faith marked his journey. Each day began with the sound of church bells and the rhythm of prayer. The chapel, often built at the very heart of the royal residence, was a constant presence. Kings attended mass, heard confessions, and joined processions that reminded them of their sacred responsibilities. Even the smallest decisions were often framed as acts of service to God. A king's relationship with the church was both spiritual and political. On one hand, he looked to bishops, abbots, and priests for moral guidance. On the other, he relied on the church's support to strengthen his legitimacy. The clergy were among the most educated people of the time, able to read, write, and interpret law. Their counsel was invaluable in drafting charters, settling disputes, and recording history. Yet this relationship was not always peaceful. At times, kings clashed with church leaders over authority, taxation, or the appointment of bishops. These conflicts revealed the delicate balance between spiritual duty and earthly power. For the king himself, faith was often a source of comfort in a turbulent world. Wars, plagues, and rebellions weighed heavily upon him, and prayer offered solace. Kings knelt before relics of saints, sought divine guidance before battle, and offered gifts to monasteries in thanksgiving for victories. Pilgrimages to holy shrines were not uncommon, as rulers traveled long distances to seek healing or forgiveness. These journeys, though arduous, reflected a king's awareness of his own mortality and dependence on divine favor. Religion also shaped the image of kingship. Chronicles and songs described kings as shepherds of their people, entrusted with protecting their flock. Justice was considered not only a legal duty, but a spiritual one, as the king was expected to rule with fairness in accordance with God's law. Mercy and charity were equally valued. A pious king was praised for feeding the poor, building churches, and protecting the weak. Such acts were believed to earn not only earthly loyalty, but heavenly reward. Yet religion could also weigh heavily on a king's conscience. Medieval rulers were deeply aware of sin and the threat of eternal damnation. The violence of warfare, the burdens of taxation, and the harsh punishments dealt to rebels all raised questions of moral responsibility. Some kings spent their final years in penance, wearing simple robes, fasting, and giving away wealth to secure forgiveness. Others commissioned prayers to be said on their behalf, long after their deaths, filling abbeys with monks whose daily chants would intercede for their souls. Consider for a moment the quiet routine of a king at prayer. He enters the chapel at dawn, the air cool and heavy with the scent of incense. The flickering light of candles dances across stone walls. A choir of monks begins to sing, their voices rising in gentle harmony. The king bows his head, perhaps weary from the burdens of rule, and listens. For a few moments, he is not a commander of armies or a judge of disputes, but simply a man seeking peace in the presence of the divine. The queen and royal family shared in this devotion, joining processions, lighting candles, and supporting religious works. Together, they set an example for their subjects, showing that piety was not reserved for monasteries, but was an essential part of daily life. Festivals, feast days, and holy seasons filled the calendar, giving rhythm to the year and drawing king and commoner alike into shared acts of worship. Even architecture bore witness to the role of faith. Castles and palaces often had private chapels built with exquisite care, their stained glass windows filling the space with colored light. Cathedrals, towering above medieval towns, stood as both monuments to God and symbols of royal patronage. By funding these great works, kings declared their devotion in stone, ensuring that their legacy would endure long after their reign had ended. Religion, however, was not simply a private comfort or a public display. It was also a powerful instrument of unity. In times of crisis, kings called upon their people to pray together for deliverance. Victories in battle were celebrated with thanksgiving masses, while defeats were met with days of fasting and repentance. The shared language of faith bound king and people together, creating a sense of common purpose in a world often divided by war and uncertainty. To understand the role of religion in a king's life is to glimpse the heartbeat of the medieval world. It was not a separate part of life, but its very core. Kings ruled with the constant awareness that their crowns rested not only on their heads, but in the hands of God. Their triumphs, their failures, their hopes, and their fears were all framed within the vast tapestry of faith. As you drift into sleep, imagine the soft echo of chants in a dimly lit chapel, the gentle touch of holy oil on a king's brow, the quiet rustle of robes as he kneels before the altar. In that silence, we see not just a ruler, but a man seeking guidance, strength, and peace. In the stillness of faith, even the mightiest king became humble, a reminder that, in the medieval world, every throne was but a step beneath heaven. When we think of knights, it is easy to imagine shining armor, noble quests, and tales of chivalry. But for those who actually lived the life of a knight, the reality was far harsher, filled with grueling duties, constant danger, and a never-ending demand for loyalty. Behind the pageantry of tournaments and the glittering image of honor lay a daily existence that was as exhausting as it was deadly. To be a knight in the medieval world was not just a privilege, but a heavy responsibility that shaped every waking moment. From a young age, the path to knighthood was demanding. Boys of noble birth were often sent away from home to serve as pages in the household of another lord. There, they learned discipline, obedience, and the fundamentals of combat. They carried weapons for older knights, polished armor until it gleamed, and studied courtly manners. As teenagers, they advanced to the role of squire, where training grew far more intense. Squires accompanied their masters onto the battlefield, learning firsthand the brutal realities of war. Each step of this journey prepared them for the solemn moment when, often at a religious ceremony, they were dubbed knights and sworn to uphold the code of chivalry. This code was not a written law, but an ideal, an expectation that knights would be loyal to their lords, protective of the weak, and defenders of the faith. In reality, these duties often clashed with the harsh demands of survival and politics. A knight might be called upon to fight not in defense of the innocent, but in service of a lord's ambition or to expand territory. The line between noble protector and ruthless warrior was thin, and many knights lived in that uncertain space. The battlefield was the true test of a knight's duty. Clad in armor that could weigh more than 50 pounds, they rode into combat with sword, lance, or mace in hand. The clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, and the cries of men filled the air. To fight as a knight was to live in constant awareness of death. Injuries were common, and medical care was primitive. Yet knights were expected to charge forward with courage, to lead rather than retreat, and to embody bravery even when fear gripped their hearts. Outside of war, knights were also enforcers of order. Lords relied on them to uphold justice across their lands, to collect taxes, and to protect travelers from bandits. These duties were far less glamorous than stories suggest, but they were vital. A knight might spend weeks patrolling roads, guarding bridges, or standing watch at a castle gate. Their presence symbolized authority, a visible reminder of a lord's power. Knights also had a role in the cultural life of the medieval world. Tournaments, though celebrated as displays of skill and bravery, were not mere entertainment. They were opportunities to sharpen battle skills, test strength, and win favor. A successful performance in the lists could earn a knight not only wealth, but the admiration of nobles and the chance to secure patronage. Yet these events were dangerous. Injuries and even deaths were not uncommon, reminding participants that glory often carried a heavy price. The spiritual dimension of knighthood was just as important. Knights were expected to be defenders of the church, sworn to uphold Christian values. Many saw themselves as soldiers of God, and some joined crusades, where faith and warfare merged in a cause that was presented as holy. For those who could not travel to distant lands, religious devotion was still central. Knights prayed before battles, carried relics for protection, and sought confession to cleanse their souls from the blood they spilled. At the same time, the daily life of a knight was far from constant warfare. When not fighting, many lived quietly on their estates, overseeing land, collecting rents, and maintaining their equipment. The care of armor and weapons was a full-time task. Rust had to be scrubbed away, blades sharpened, and horses trained. A knight's warhorse, or destrier, was as vital as his sword, and caring for it required patience and skill. Despite the honor associated with their station, knights faced hardships that could not be ignored. The expense of maintaining armor, weapons, and horses was immense. Many knights struggled with debt, relying on their lords for support, or seeking fortunes through marriage. Loyalty was costly, and service often demanded sacrifice of wealth as well as blood. Yet, for all the weight of their duties, Knights held a powerful place in the medieval imagination. To peasants, they were figures of awe, towering in armor and riding beneath fluttering banners. To nobles, they were trusted warriors whose loyalty could decide the fate of kingdoms. To poets and storytellers, they were the embodiment of chivalry, courage, and romance. These layers of meaning gave knighthood a mythic quality, even as real knights labored under its harsh demands. Imagine, for a moment, the end of a knight's long day. His armor is set aside, dented from training or patrols. He sits before a fire, hands calloused, muscles sore, yet his thoughts restless. Tomorrow may bring another battle, another duty, another test of loyalty. He whispers a prayer, asking for strength, for courage, and perhaps for peace. Beneath the armor, beneath the stories, he is simply a man burdened by the weight of service. The life of a knight was never easy, but it was never ordinary. It was a calling shaped by loyalty, tested by danger, and sustained by faith. Their duties were deadly, but they defined an entire age. Through the silence of the night, as we reflect on their lives, we can sense the echo of hooves, the clash of swords, and the quiet courage that carried them through a world of both glory and hardship. When we think of medieval castles, our minds often linger on the towering walls, moats, and knights in shining armor. But behind the imposing gates and lofty battlements, there were lives quietly shaping the destiny of kingdoms, those of queens. These women often wielded influence far beyond what their titles suggested, managing estates, guiding heirs, and navigating a labyrinth of politics that could be just as dangerous as any battlefield. Their lives were filled with both opportunity and peril, and like every corner of the castle, danger often lurked quietly, waiting for a misstep. A queen's position was rarely earned solely through her own accomplishments. Most were born into noble families and married strategically, often as part of alliances designed to secure peace, land, or military advantage. Yet, despite the political nature of their unions, queens became the glue holding castles and kingdoms together. They oversaw domestic life, managed finances, and made crucial decisions when kings were absent, whether on crusades, diplomatic missions, or in battle. Every decision, from rationing grain to authorizing repairs to the castle, could carry life or death consequences. The courtly education of a queen was rigorous and multifaceted. From childhood, she was trained in literacy, music, religion, and etiquette, as well as the arts of negotiation, diplomacy, and sometimes warfare. These lessons were necessary because while kings led armies, queens often led the household and, in their absence, the kingdom itself. A miscalculated word in court or a misjudged alliance could bring disaster, not just to herself, but to everyone under her charge. Queens were also the caretakers of dynasties. They bore children who would inherit lands and crowns, and the stakes were higher than one might imagine. Childbirth in the medieval period was perilous, with maternal mortality rates frighteningly high. Many queens faced the daily terror of pregnancy, knowing that each birth could claim their life. Yet they persevered, driven by duty and love, knowing that securing an heir was essential for the stability of their realm. Beyond childbirth and family, queens played roles that required extraordinary emotional intelligence. They mediated disputes among nobles, soothed tensions between factions, and occasionally intervened in matters of justice. Their influence could prevent conflicts, avert rebellions, or shape alliances that would determine the survival of the castle and the kingdom. Yet this power came at a personal cost. Queens were constantly under scrutiny, their words and actions dissected, their reputations vulnerable to rumor or manipulation. The walls of the castle, meant to protect, could feel like prisons when political intrigue, became suffocating. The daily life of a queen was a blend of ceremonial duties and private toil. She presided over meals, led religious observances, and hosted foreign dignitaries. These occasions were choreographed with precision, each movement conveying authority, grace, and control. At the same time, queens were managers of households that could number in the hundreds. They supervised kitchens, stables, and servants, ensuring the smooth operation of the castle. A mistake in logistics, spoiled food, mismanaged supplies, or neglected repairs could have cascading effects, affecting both morale and safety. Queens were also patrons of culture and learning. Many commissioned manuscripts, supported artists, and fostered education within the castle walls. This aspect of their lives brought light into otherwise harsh, sometimes deadly environments. Their libraries became refuges for the mind, quiet sanctuaries amidst the constant noise of a living fortress. In these moments, one can almost picture a queen seated by a flickering candle, reading in the stillness of her chambers, while the castle slept, a quiet haven in a world ruled by duty and danger. Yet, for all their influence, queens were not immune to the hazards that filled castle life. The same narrow staircases, uneven floors, and precarious balconies that threatened knights and nobles could claim unsuspecting victims at court. Illness spread quickly through even the most carefully managed households, and queens often bore the brunt of epidemics, caring for sick children and advisors alike while risking their own health. Poisoning, whether accidental or deliberate, was a constant fear. Political rivals, envious courtiers, or foreign emissaries sometimes viewed queens as obstacles or opportunities, and subtle threats could prove fatal. Despite these dangers, many queens embraced their roles with courage, resilience, and ingenuity. They learned to navigate the treacherous waters of court life, building alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and carefully chosen confidence. Some became regents, ruling in place of absent or underage kings. Their decisions could guide the kingdom through famine, rebellion, or foreign invasion. Every choice was weighted with consequence, and yet, they often executed their duties with calm precision, balancing the demands of survival, legacy, and leadership. Consider the life of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous queens of the medieval era. Her influence spanned 2 kingdoms, and she managed her estates with intelligence and authority, shaping the political landscape of her time. Yet her life was also a story of danger and resilience, political imprisonments, family betrayals, and conflicts with kings and sons alike. Her story illustrates both the power and vulnerability inherent in the life of a queen, revealing how their roles, though often unseen in history books, were crucial to the survival of medieval kingdoms. At night, behind the protective walls of the castle, a queen's life was often as solitary as it was significant. She would walk the quiet corridors, checking on servants, children, or wounded knights, her presence both comforting and commanding. In these hours, away from the formalities of court and the clamor of daily duties, she might reflect on the weight of responsibility, the fragility of life, and the silent strategies required to maintain order and safety. Queens were the unseen architects of medieval life. Their influence stretched from domestic management to politics, from diplomacy to defense, and from culture to family legacy. Yet, for all their authority, they faced the same relentless realities that made castles death traps for knights and servants alike. Every chamber, staircase, and wall held potential danger, but queens moved through them with careful vigilance, shaping history quietly yet profoundly. As we imagine the lives of these remarkable women, we see that the story of medieval castles is not just one of stone, steel, and swords. It is also a story of those who lived, loved, and labored behind the throne, negotiating the precarious balance between power and peril. In the silent moments before sleep, it is their courage, patience, and resourcefulness that resonate most, reminding us that true strength often lies in resilience and quiet determination. In the quiet corners of medieval castles, danger often lingered in subtle, invisible forms. Beyond the obvious threats of siege or battle, the most insidious perils were sometimes hidden in plain sight, within the walls, the kitchens, and even the food and drink that sustained the inhabitants. Poison was a constant fear, not only because of political enemies, but also because of the precarious realities of castle life: spoiled food, contaminated water, and poorly preserved medicines. For a kingdom's ruler, or even a resident of noble standing, every meal could carry the shadow of death. The concept of poisoning was not merely a theatrical plot device of novels or legends. In a world without refrigeration, sterilization, or modern storage, food and drink could become lethal without warning. Kitchens, the heart of the castle, were places of relentless activity and constant hazard. Massive cauldrons hung over roaring fires, and ingredients were stored in wooden bens that attracted vermin. Grain, a staple of the medieval diet, often became infested with mold or insects, creating toxins that could induce hallucinations, convulsions, or sudden death. Every cup of water drawn from a castle well carried the potential for unseen danger, whether from natural contamination or seepage from latrines and waste channels. Yet alongside these natural hazards, there existed deliberate threats. A poisoned chalice or a tainted dish could alter the course of history. Political intrigue was a constant in castle life, with ambitious courtiers, rivals, or even family members sometimes resorting to subterfuge to gain advantage. Queens, kings, and heirs were all vulnerable to assassination attempts, disguised as accidents or misfortune. The knowledge that a meal could contain a hidden enemy lent attention to every banquet, a subtle and constant anxiety woven into the daily rhythm of castle life. The psychological impact of such threats was profound. Castle residents often lived under the quiet pressure of suspicion. Servants were carefully scrutinized, food was tested and retested, and drinking vessels were occasionally marked or guarded. The act of eating, normally a source of comfort and sustenance, became a ritual of vigilance. Even a simple glass of wine required careful consideration. Was it from a trusted source? Or had someone tampered with it during its preparation? This invisible danger created an environment where trust was fragile, and every action required cautious deliberation. Consider the daily routine of a medieval queen or noble. They would awaken in chambers fortified for protection, yet even there, safety was never absolute. Meals were brought by attendants who, though loyal, were still part of a larger network of human ambition, error, and vulnerability. Food was prepared in distant kitchens where heat, smoke, and human oversight intersected, making accidental contamination as plausible as deliberate harm. Herbs were used for flavoring, preservation, or medicinal purposes, but these same herbs, if misused, could prove toxic. The line between nourishment and danger was often thin, and a lapse in attention could be fatal. Hidden threats extended beyond food and drink. Architectural features of the castle itself sometimes became silent instruments of peril. Narrow corridors, hidden staircases, and poorly lit passages could mask danger, making ambush or accident more likely. Secret rooms or hidden passages offered refuge, but also became traps if misused or forgotten. A misstep in the darkness could send someone tumbling into a pit, or down a spiral staircase designed to disorient attackers. In this way, the castle's defensive ingenuity sometimes mirrored the psychological tension created by human treachery. Every stone, every shadow, could conceal risk. The use of poison in political maneuvering was as much about symbolism as practicality. A poisoned chalice was a visible reminder of the fragility of trust and the omnipresence of danger. Historical accounts suggest that rulers and nobles often carried antidotes, or at least relied on intuition to avoid potentially fatal meals. Meals were observed by trusted advisors, herbs were carefully selected, and potions were tested. Even in the sanctuary of one's own chambers, caution was paramount. These precautions were not paranoia, but practical responses to the realities of a world where assassination, accident, and disease intersected. Beyond the human and architectural threats, the natural environment contributed its own quiet dangers. Mold, mildew, and contaminated water were invisible enemies, slowly weakening inhabitants or causing sudden illness. The thick stone walls that protected against external attack also trapped moisture, creating conditions conducive to bacterial growth. Food stored in barrels or bens could ferment or decay unnoticed. Water drawn from cisterns or wells could harbor pathogens that medieval residents could not identify or purify. The very systems designed for survival could, paradoxically, become sources of danger. Castle residents learned to live with these hazards, cultivating vigilance and resilience. Kitchens became places of ritualized care, with food preparation following routines honed over generations. Nobles observed their environment carefully, noting changes in taste, smell, or appearance of provisions. Healers and physicians, often part of the castle staff, employed the limited knowledge of their era to mitigate these threats, using herbs, poultices, and primitive sanitation practices. Every precaution was necessary, yet none could eliminate risk entirely. Political intrigue often magnified the dangers inherent in castle life. Disputes over succession, land, or alliances sometimes found their most lethal expression in subtle acts of sabotage. Poison, for those with access and knowledge, could shift power without the need for open battle. The fear of unseen enemies, human or natural, permeated the castle atmosphere, making each day a delicate balance of trust, vigilance, and survival. This quiet tension, layered upon the physical dangers of stone walls, narrow passages, and high towers, created a psychological landscape as perilous as any battlefield. Even leisure and celebration could carry risk. Feasts, while intended to display wealth and reinforce alliances, became exercises in careful observation. Guests and hosts alike monitored what was consumed, how it was served, and who had access to the kitchen. Ceremonial toasts were both expressions of unity and subtle tests of awareness. A misjudged gesture, an overlooked ingredient, or a moment of inattentiveness could have catastrophic consequences. In this environment, medieval residents developed skills of caution, observation, and intuition that were essential for survival. Queens, kings, and courtiers alike honed their senses to detect threats hidden in plain sight. Trust was earned cautiously and maintained with care. The castle, for all its imposing walls and defensive structures, could never fully shield inhabitants from the subtleties of danger that lay in human behavior, contaminated food, or the treacherous architecture designed for protection yet capable of harm. As we reflect on the quiet, invisible perils of the medieval castle, it becomes clear that survival was not just a matter of strength or swordsmanship. Awareness, patience, and vigilance were equally vital. Every meal, every step, and every choice carried weight, demanding mindfulness in a world where danger was constant and often unseen. The poisoned chalice and hidden threats remind us that the castle, impressive and fortified as it may have been, was never truly safe. Life within its walls required intelligence, caution, and an unyielding respect for the delicate balance between security and vulnerability. In the stillness of night, when the candles flickered and the halls were quiet, these threats, though invisible, hovered in the minds of all who lived within the castle. Every cup raised, every bite taken, and every corridor traversed was a negotiation with unseen dangers, a testament to the resilience and prudence of those who called these formidable fortresses home. In the life of a medieval castle, the threat of siege was an ever-present reality, a shadow that could fall suddenly or linger for months. Unlike the dramatic battles recounted in chronicles, sieges were often slow, methodical affairs, testing patience, resourcefulness, and endurance rather than martial skill alone. They were exercises in human psychology, logistics, and ingenuity, demanding both defenders and attackers to navigate an intricate dance of strategy, deception, and resilience. For the residents of a fortress, the arrival of an enemy force meant that the familiar routines of daily life would be irrevocably altered. Every meal, every trip to the well, and every movement through the corridors became fraught with anxiety and careful calculation. At the onset of a siege, the castle would transform from a noble residence into a fortified city under pressure. Gates were barred, drawbridges raised, and outer wards secured. Guards and soldiers took up positions along battlements, archers prepared their bows, and those untrained in combat, servants, artisans, and children, were ushered into inner chambers for safety. The atmosphere inside the castle shifted subtly, at first a heightened awareness of noise, an unspoken tension in conversations, and a constant attention to detail in every aspect of daily life. Residents quickly learned that the success of their survival depended not solely on the strength of the walls, but on discipline, foresight, and careful coordination. Food became the central concern almost immediately. A siege was, at its core, a battle of endurance. Whoever could outlast the other often emerged victorious. Granaries, pantries, and storage rooms were meticulously inventoried. Wheat, barley, oats, and legumes were rationed, carefully portioned to sustain the population for as long as possible. Dried meat and fish, preserved with salt or smoke, became primary sources of protein. Yet even with careful planning, the passage of time introduced complications. Spoilage, vermin infestation, and the inevitable depletion of supplies created constant anxiety. Every morsel of food was precious, and the act of eating became an exercise in mindfulness and rationing rather than indulgence. Water presented a similar challenge. Medieval castles often relied on wells dug deep within the fortifications, providing a secure, if limited, supply. Rainwater collection systems supplemented these wells, but sieges could render external sources dangerous or inaccessible. The inhabitants learned to monitor consumption carefully, avoiding waste while balancing the critical need for hydration. Illness and dehydration became as dangerous as enemy arrows, reminding all that survival required careful management of every natural resource within the walls. Psychological warfare played a profound role during sieges. Attackers understood that the strain of confinement and uncertainty could erode morale as effectively as any catapult or battering ram. They used tactics ranging from constant noise and intimidation to starvation and deception. Defenders, in turn, learned to employ countermeasures, signaling allies, faking strength, or conserving resources in ways that projected resilience. The castle itself became a silent participant in this psychological contest, its walls, towers, and corridors shaping the minds of both those inside and outside. Fear, anxiety, and hope intertwined, creating an environment where mental acuity was as vital as physical strength. life under siege was an exercise in adaptation. Daily routines were recalibrated to accommodate new realities: kitchens adjusted meal preparation to ration supplies. Guards rotated in exhausting shifts, and artisans contributed to the fortification of walls or repair of damaged structures. Every member of the castle community, regardless of social status, played a role in sustaining life and ensuring defense. Children learned quickly to navigate corridors quietly, to obey instructions without hesitation, and to respect the invisible rules that governed survival during these tense times. Even seemingly mundane actions, drawing water, tending fires, or fetching supplies, were executed with heightened caution, as the consequences of error could be immediate and severe. Medical care became another critical aspect of siege life. Injuries from accidents, minor skirmishes, or defensive duties required attention, yet resources were limited. Surgeons and healers improvised with herbal remedies, poultices, and basic surgical instruments, providing comfort and care wherever possible. Disease remained a constant threat, particularly in crowded inner wards, where poor ventilation and limited sanitation compounded the risk. Even the most carefully planned siege could see an outbreak of illness, reminding all that human vulnerability was as much a challenge as military strategy. The architecture of the castle played a critical role in survival. Towers offered vantage points for observation and early warning, while arrow slits and murder holes allowed defenders to engage the enemy without exposing themselves. Inner wards provided relative safety and space to store supplies, while secret passages and hidden rooms offered escape routes or temporary refuge. The very design that made castles formidable military structures also provided a framework for endurance. Narrow corridors slowed potential infiltrators. Elevated platforms allowed defenders to maximize efficiency, and concentric walls created layered defenses that prolonged resistance. Even during the monotony of a prolonged siege, moments of humanity persisted. Residents found ways to maintain morale: storytelling, quiet music, prayer, and the occasional shared meal offered comfort. Candlelight flickered in the great halls, and whispered conversations carried tales of hope, courage, and remembrance. These rituals, small yet significant, reminded all within the castle of life beyond the walls and of the reasons they endured. The interplay of fear and resilience, danger and hope, became a defining feature of castle life during these long periods of confinement. As days and weeks passed, siege tactics evolved. Attackers attempted to breach walls with battering rams, undermined foundations, or launched flaming projectiles to ignite stores or disrupt defenses. Defenders responded with ingenuity: counter, mines, boiling oil, and carefully timed sorties sought to weaken the enemy's resolve. Every structural feature of the castle was tested, from walls to towers, battlements to gates. Residents moved with measured steps, aware that a single misjudgment could result in injury or death. Survival required constant vigilance, adaptability, and the quiet courage to face an uncertain future. Ultimately, life under siege demonstrated the extraordinary resilience of castle inhabitants. These stone fortresses, formidable as they were, depended on the cooperation, ingenuity, and endurance of those within. The walls offered protection, but it was the human spirit, the willingness to adapt, to ration, to endure, that defined success. Those who lived through prolonged sieges emerged with a deep appreciation for the fragility and strength of life within the medieval castle, understanding that every day survived was a testament to skill, patience, and courage. Even after the siege ended, the echoes of those tense days lingered. Structural damage required repair, supplies needed replenishment, and the psychological effects of confinement and constant danger persisted. Residents carried with them the lessons of endurance, caution, awareness, and the intricate understanding that survival depended on both human ingenuity and the fortress itself. In the quiet aftermath, the castle, scarred but unbroken, stood as a silent witness to the resilience, perseverance, and quiet heroism of those who had endured its trials. In the stillness of night, when the siege had passed and life returned to its gentle rhythms, the castle seemed to exhale, offering refuge to those within. Every stone, every corridor, and every hidden passage bore witness to the subtle interplay of danger and survival. A delicate balance maintained through careful planning, human ingenuity, and enduring courage. The legacy of these fortresses is not merely in their walls or towers, but in the extraordinary resilience of the people who called them home. In the medieval castle, the kitchen was a place of constant activity, a hub of essential work, and an environment fraught with unseen danger. While the great halls hosted nobles, feasting on roasted meats and hearty stews, the kitchens remained the domain of cooks, apprentices, and kitchen servants who labored behind the scenes to sustain life within the fortress walls. To an outsider, these spaces may have appeared bustling yet ordinary. But for those who worked within them, the kitchens were a labyrinth of hazards, a delicate balance of heat, smoke, and raw materials where a single misstep could have fatal consequences. The first and most immediate danger came from fire itself. Kitchens were built with massive hearths, designed to accommodate enormous cauldrons, and spits for roasting whole animals. Flames roared with unpredictable intensity, consuming timber fuel at a rapid pace, and radiating heat that could scorch the unprepared. Cooking for a castle's population meant tending to multiple fires simultaneously, each requiring careful monitoring. A momentary lapse could allow flames to leap to thatched ceilings, wooden beams, or nearby piles of straw, turning a place of nourishment into a death trap. Even the most experienced cooks learned to respect the unpredictable nature of fire, developing an almost intuitive sense for its moods and patterns. Hanging above the hearths were chains, suspending massive cauldrons, sometimes large enough to hold an entire pig or several gallons of soup. These chains, forged long before modern understanding of metal fatigue, could snap without warning, sending searing liquid cascading across the floor. Slips, trips, or misjudged movements could result in devastating burns. Stone floors, perpetually slick with grease, spilled liquids, and discarded food, created a treacherous surface where one wrong step could propel a servant into boiling water or flames. Kitchens were, in essence, vertical and horizontal gauntlets, where every action carried the risk of sudden injury. Smoke and fumes added another layer of peril. Chimneys were primitive, designed to vent smoke, but often inadequate for the size and number of fires in a castle kitchen. Dense clouds of smoke would fill the space, stinging eyes, choking lungs, and reducing visibility. Servants moved cautiously, guided more by touch and memory than by sight. Over time, this constant exposure caused long-term respiratory issues, yet work could not cease. For the survival of the castle's residents depended on the continuous preparation of food. Even a small lapse in attention to the fires or smoke could result in a disaster that imperiled not only those in the kitchen, but potentially the entire castle. Preparation of food presented subtler, invisible dangers. Meat, fish, and grains were preserved using salt, smoke, or drying techniques. Yet decomposition still occurred at a slow but relentless pace. Inadequately stored or contaminated ingredients harbored bacteria and parasites that could strike suddenly. A seemingly innocent bite could trigger dysentery, food poisoning, or worse. Cooks became adept at detecting spoilage through smell and touch, developing a keen sense for the limits of freshness. Even then, the limited knowledge of disease meant that invisible pathogens were a constant, silent threat. Water, essential for both cooking and cleaning, brought its own hazards. Wells and cisterns within the castle were often located near latrines or drainage systems, making contamination a frequent concern. Boiling water was used to mitigate some risk, but it could not eliminate it entirely. The act of drawing water, lifting heavy buckets, and transporting it across slippery floors presented a daily challenge. One misstep could result in scalding, broken bones, or worse. As servants navigated corridors cluttered with tools, spilled ingredients, and rushing colleagues. Kitchens were also a place of intense labor and exhaustion. Tasks were repetitive and physically demanding: chopping, grinding, lifting, stirring, and kneading, often for hours on end. The heat, combined with poor ventilation and long working hours, created conditions that could quickly sap strength and awareness. Fatigue heightened the likelihood of accidents, and the consequences were immediate. Servants carried not only the burden of maintaining the castle's sustenance, but also the constant mental weight of avoiding life, threatening mistakes in a space where the margin for error was vanishingly small. Iron implements, used for cooking and storage, presented further hazards. Heavy iron pots, utensils, and tripods could fall from shelves or burn surfaces if mishandled. Chains and hooks corroded over time, making them unpredictable. Sharp knives and cleavers, essential for butchering and preparation, were in constant use, demanding constant vigilance. Cuts, punctures, and blunt force injuries were common, and even minor wounds could become infected. Given the unsanitary conditions that were often unavoidable in the medieval environment, the architecture of the kitchens themselves amplified these dangers. Low ceilings, narrow passages, and uneven stone floors forced careful navigation while working under pressure. Staircases connecting kitchen levels were particularly treacherous, worn smooth by years of use and slick with grease or moisture. A hurried ascent or descent could send a servant tumbling into hot fires, sharp tools, or hard stone surfaces. Hidden corners and alcoves, where ingredients or tools were stored, could conceal hazards that became apparent only at the moment of contact. Even the storage of food posed risk. Granaries and pantries, built into the thickness of castle walls, often became homes for rats, mice, and insects. These creatures not only consumed supplies, but also spread disease. Mold and fungi could develop in grains and preserved foods, releasing toxins capable of causing illness or hallucination. Servants worked with these supplies daily, sometimes inhaling spores or coming into contact with contaminated surfaces, unknowingly exposing themselves to invisible dangers. Despite these threats, medieval kitchens were remarkable centers of ingenuity and adaptation. Servants developed techniques to manage fire, optimize food preservation, and navigate the hazardous space efficiently. Wooden pegs and rails were used to hang pots safely, while careful scheduling ensured that multiple fires and workers did not interfere dangerously with each other. Experience and knowledge accumulated over time allowed for the survival of both individuals and the castle population as a whole. In quieter moments, away from the heat and bustle, kitchens also offered glimpses of humanity and ritual. Stories were whispered, simple songs hummed, and shared laughter punctuated the long hours. The work, though dangerous and exhausting, became a form of discipline and community, binding the kitchen staff together in shared responsibility. In these small acts of camaraderie, the castle's inhabitants found strength to endure, understanding that survival was not only about avoiding hazards, but also about maintaining morale, patience, and resilience in the face of constant danger. The dark kitchens of medieval castles, with their hidden fires, boiling cauldrons, and ever-present threats, exemplified the perilous balance between sustenance and survival. Every meal prepared, every fire tended, and every step taken carried the potential for disaster. Yet, through careful practice, vigilance, and a quiet understanding of the dangers, those who worked in these spaces ensured the continuation of life within the fortress walls. In the dim glow of hearths and candlelight, amidst the heat, smoke, and clatter of utensils, the medieval kitchen was more than a place of labor. It was a crucible of endurance, skill, and quiet courage. And as night fell and the rest of the castle slept, the hidden fires continued to burn, sustaining life, while silently testing the mettle of those who tended them. Beneath the bustling halls and echoing corridors of a medieval castle lay spaces few ever willingly visited, the dungeons. Dark, cold, and suffocating, these subterranean chambers were designed to instill fear and enforce discipline. Yet beyond their reputation for punishment and despair, dungeons offer a profound insight into the realities of medieval life. A silent world where human vulnerability was on constant display, and the interplay of architecture, psychology, and survival became painfully evident. Dungeons were never intended as comfortable spaces. Their stone walls, often thick and unyielding, retained cold and damp, creating conditions that gnawed at the body and spirit. Moisture seeped from the earth, soaking into the walls and pooling on the uneven floors. Drips from the ceilings echoed in hollow corridors, a constant, monotonous rhythm that seemed almost designed to unsettle the mind. The air was dense with a mix of mold, mildew, and the faint odor of decay. Ventilation was minimal, stale, fetid air settled in corners, filling the lungs with a chill that seeped deep into the bones. Those who spent even a few hours below ground would emerge shivering and weakened, their bodies already betraying the invisible assault of cold and damp. Lighting, when it existed at all, came from sparse candles or small, barred openings high on the walls. Shadows clung to every surface, elongating figures and distorting shapes. In such a place, the imagination could run unchecked, turning ordinary sounds, a scurrying rat, the drip of water, the rustle of straw, into imagined threats. The psychological pressure of these dimly lit chambers was immense. Prisoners often described the feeling of being watched, of being suspended between worlds, neither fully in the castle above, nor entirely free from its oppressive architecture. Even a brief stay in the dungeons could leave a lasting mark on the mind, sowing the seeds of fear and paranoia that lingered long after release. Dungeons were designed for confinement first and safety second. Stone walls and iron bars made escape nearly impossible, but the very materials that ensured containment also created new hazards. Floors were uneven, often littered with rubble, broken tools, or remnants of previous occupants. Slips and falls were common, and the lack of light made every misstep potentially disastrous. Sharp, edged stones and protruding iron fixtures posed constant risks, transforming the environment into a subtle but relentless gauntlet. The architecture itself, while effective in restraining, became a quiet killer for the unwary. Sanitation, or the lack thereof, was one of the most insidious threats within the dungeon. Waste was collected in primitive latrines, or simply left to accumulate in corners, producing overwhelming odors and fertile grounds for disease. Rats and vermin thrived in this environment, feeding on scraps and contaminating the meager rations of prisoners. Fleas and lice spread disease, while stagnant water in small pools became breeding grounds for pathogens. The combination of dampness, filth, and poor ventilation created ideal conditions for dysentery, cholera, and other medieval illnesses. Even a prisoner who had survived the perils above ground could fall victim to the hidden dangers lurking below. The very design of the dungeon contributed to its effectiveness as a place of punishment. Some chambers were narrow, forcing occupants to crouch or lie in uncomfortable positions for extended periods. Others were tall and cavernous, creating an eerie sense of isolation and insignificance. The layout often included blind corners and dead ends, enhancing the sense of entrapment. Noise, whether the creak of the castle above or the distant footsteps of guards, was amplified in the stone corridors, making even ordinary sounds feel threatening. These design choices were deliberate, reinforcing the psychological impact of confinement and heightening the stress of imprisonment. Prisoners were frequently subjected to additional hazards that were structural as well as environmental. Chains and iron fittings, used to restrain individuals, could cause injury or infection if neglected. Stone walls, cold and rough, led to abrasions or bruises when prisoners were forced to sit or lie against them for long periods. Occasional flooding during heavy rains or the infiltration of melted snow could turn a dungeon floor into a slick hazard, endangering even those careful enough to avoid the worst obstacles. Every element of the space combined to ensure that the dungeon remained a place of quiet torment, even without the presence of guards or overt punishment. Despite these dangers, dungeons also served practical purposes. They were spaces for detaining captured soldiers, criminals, or political prisoners. They could hold those awaiting trial, providing a form of containment in a world without formalized policing. The very isolation of the dungeon allowed castle authorities to exercise control over individuals with minimal oversight. The architectural genius, or cruelty, of these spaces lay in their ability to enforce discipline with almost invisible means. Fear, discomfort, and constant exposure to risk became instruments as effective as any weapon. Life in the dungeon demanded adaptation. Prisoners learned to navigate the dark corridors, to ration food and water, and to endure cold and damp with as much grace as possible. Some improvised bedding from straw or rags, while others relied on sheer willpower to survive. Sleep was difficult. The mind remained alert to every drip, every shift in shadows, every distant echo. Time itself became distorted, with hours stretching endlessly into a monotony that could erode both memory and hope. Yet even in the depths of these stone prisons, there were small glimpses of human resilience. Prisoners formed quiet bonds, shared meager food, or whispered stories to maintain sanity. These acts of connection became vital lifelines, countering the oppressive solitude that dungeons imposed. It was a stark reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit sought comfort, companionship, and continuity. Medieval dungeons, then, were far more than mere holding cells. They were microcosms of the castle itself, spaces where architecture, psychology, and survival intersected in ways both subtle and brutal. Every stone, every iron bar, every shadow was designed or positioned to create vulnerability. Yet even as they inflicted physical and mental strain, dungeons also revealed the adaptability, ingenuity, and endurance of those who endured them. As night fell across the castle, the dungeons remained silent, their prisoners pressed against stone, listening to the distant sounds of life above. Fires in the kitchens dimmed, guards' footsteps faded, and the castle itself seemed to hold its breath. In the cold, darkness, and stillness, the dungeons whispered their stories. Not of heroism or glory, but of human resilience in the face of unrelenting adversity. Here, in these silent, subterranean chambers, medieval life revealed its harshest truths, the delicate balance between survival and suffering. and the quiet courage required to endure even the most hidden of death traps. Rising high above the rest of the castle, the towers were both symbols of power and instruments of peril. From a distance, they projected strength, dominance, and the architectural genius of medieval engineers. But up close, these towering structures revealed a hidden truth. Within their walls lurked a constant, quiet danger, a threat that could claim lives without warning, often through nothing more than a misstep or the natural decay of time. The towers, elegant in their vertical ambition, were among the most precarious and deadly parts of any castle. Constructed from massive stone blocks, towers were designed to resist siege and provide commanding views of the surrounding land. Their spiral staircases twisted upward like helical mazes, guiding defenders to vantage points while confusing intruders. Yet the very design that aided in defense also introduced significant hazards. The stairs were often narrow and uneven, carved directly from stone and worn smooth by decades or centuries of footsteps in damp or icy weather. Each step could become treacherously slick. The low ceilings and tight turns required careful navigation, leaving little room for error. A moment of inattention could send a person tumbling downward, sometimes to a fatal landing. The spiral design was intentionally biased toward right-handed defenders, making it easier to wield a sword or crossbow while forcing attackers into awkward, cramped positions. But for ordinary residents or unsuspecting visitors, the same stairs became a trap. Children, servants, or even wary nobles returning from the castle's upper chambers faced daily risks. One misjudged step, a slip on a worn edge, and the stone beneath became an agent of destruction. Chroniclers recount numerous accidents in castle towers, where residents fell from dizzying heights or collided with the walls, breaking bones or worse. Windows in towers, narrow arrow slits, were double-edged in their function. They offered light and ventilation, but their design also created hazards. The sills were often uneven, and the height from which one might fall could be fatal. Some towers featured small ledges or embrasures meant for defensive purposes. These protrusions, though strategic for archers, were deadly obstacles for anyone navigating the space without care. A child leaning too far out, a servant rushing past with a tray, or even a distracted guard could be sent plummeting into the courtyard below. The towers were also home to the castle's most precarious structural elements. Roofs and battlements, exposed to the elements, often deteriorated over time. Heavy rains, freezing winters, and scorching summers caused stones to loosen, mortar to crack, and wooden supports to warp. A once secure wall could become dangerously unstable, threatening those inside. Seasonal changes amplified these risks. Winter ice made steps treacherous, spring thaw loosened stones and mortar, and summer heat expanded metal fittings, sometimes sending them cracking through the walls. Autumn storms could tear away sections of parapet or roof, sending debris cascading onto lower floors. Even the most vigilant residents could fall victim to these hidden, natural hazards. Water also posed a hidden danger. Many towers had cisterns or rainwater collection systems, often located at the top to supply the castle below. While practical, these reservoirs created hazards for those who maintained them. Algae, stagnant water, and slippery surfaces turned maintenance into a dangerous task. In some cases, a simple misstep while carrying buckets or climbing ladders could result in falls that were as deadly as any enemy attack. The interior spaces of towers were deceptively complex. Some contained multiple floors, connected by narrow stairs and ladders, with small chambers tucked into corners. These rooms were used for storage, guard posts, or private quarters. Yet the very design that allowed for such compartmentalization also increased danger. Low ceilings, uneven floors, and abrupt steps could trip anyone unfamiliar with the layout. Heavy storage items, including barrels of grain, firewood, or weapons, added weight and shifted unpredictably, sometimes toppling onto those below. Even the furniture, simple benches, tables, or racks, could become lethal when combined with the tower's cramped and uneven spaces. Fires, often kept burning in braziers or fireplaces within the tower's upper chambers, introduced another layer of risk. Smoke accumulated quickly in these tight vertical spaces, reducing visibility and creating a suffocating atmosphere. Heat from flames could weaken wooden beams or dry the stone, increasing the likelihood of structural failure. Small sparks could ignite tapestries, curtains, or straw bedding, transforming the tower into a vertical inferno. Escape routes were limited, and in such confined, high-altitude spaces, fires often proved deadly before help could arrive. Yet, the towers were not solely instruments of danger. They were vital to survival and defense. They offered panoramic views of the surrounding lands, allowing early detection of approaching enemies. Archers stationed high above could rain arrows down upon attackers, while the walls themselves offered protection from projectiles. The height and isolation made towers ideal for observation, communication, and defense. But the benefits came at a price. Every advantage in security or surveillance introduced new hazards for those inhabiting the space daily. The psychological impact of tower life cannot be overstated. Isolation in high chambers, combined with the constant awareness of potential hazards, created a unique stress. Soldiers, servants, or even lords stationed in towers experienced heightened vigilance, a subtle but relentless tension that could erode composure over time. The dizzying heights, combined with narrow walkways and endless stairs, intensified the perception of risk. Those unaccustomed to such environments often found themselves anxious, exhausted, or disoriented. Despite these dangers, medieval people continued to build and inhabit towers. They accepted the risks because towers were integral to survival, defense, and status. Their presence projected power, deterred enemies, and provided strategic advantages impossible to achieve elsewhere. The very features that made towers treacherous — height, vertical complexity, narrow stairs — were inseparable from their function. They exemplified the medieval willingness to embrace peril as a necessary component of strength and protection. In every sense, the treacherous towers of medieval castles were a testament to the precarious balance between ambition and danger. They elevated both life and risk, offering protection and imposing threat simultaneously. They were marvels of engineering, psychological instruments, and deadly landscapes all at once. In these stone sentinels, medieval inhabitants confronted a daily reality in which survival demanded care, respect, and constant awareness. As the evening sun cast long shadows across the castle walls, the towers stood silent, their spiral staircases hidden in darkness, their narrow windows catching the fading light. Within, the air was cool and still, yet full of stories, of accidents narrowly avoided, of missteps that ended lives, of resilience and caution intertwined. To ascend or descend a tower was to participate in an intricate dance with mortality, where each step demanded attention, each movement a negotiation with gravity, and each breath a reminder of the fragile thread by which life hung. In the grand narrative of medieval castles, towers were the vertical expression of the same themes found throughout the fortress. Strength intertwined with vulnerability, protection entwined with danger, and the omnipresence of risk in even the most impressive architecture. To enter a tower was to enter a world where stone, wood, and iron were as unforgiving as any enemy. and where human ingenuity was measured not only by the heights achieved, but by the hazards survived along the way. Castles, for all their towering walls and imposing battlements, were as labyrinthine on the inside as they were formidable from afar. Beyond the grand halls, spiral staircases, and fortified gatehouses, there existed a secretive network of hidden passages. These narrow corridors, often concealed behind tapestries, false walls, or trapdoors, were designed for defense, escape, and covert movement. Yet, like every other feature of a medieval castle, they carried a quiet but constant danger. At first glance, a hidden passage might appear as a marvel of medieval ingenuity, a shortcut, a means of fleeing an invading force, or a secret route for couriers carrying vital messages. But for those who navigated them regularly, they were more often a source of anxiety than convenience. The passages were narrow, winding, and poorly lit, sometimes descending steeply or twisting around corners, so sharp that one could not see the floor ahead. Each step demanded care. A misstep could lead to bruises, sprains, or fatal falls. The walls of these corridors, usually constructed from rough, hewn stone, were uneven and damp. Moisture from the castle's foundations seeped through, creating slippery floors and a chill that sapped strength and focus. Moss and mildew often clung to the stone, making handholds uncertain. In some passages, the ceilings were so low that taller residents were forced to stoop or crawl, heightening the risk of bumping one's head or losing balance. The more complex the passage, the greater the danger, for the twists and turns concealed pitfalls, steps, and sudden drops. Hidden passages served many purposes, often dictated by the whims of the castle's lord or the strategic needs of the era. Some were secret staircases connecting private chambers to the outer walls, or escape points outside the castle grounds. Others were supply corridors, allowing food, water, and weapons to be moved discreetly during a siege. A few served as prisoner conduits, leading captives from dungeons to courtrooms or to concealed holding cells. Despite their utility, these passages were rarely designed with comfort or safety in mind. Their primary purpose was concealment and tactical advantage, not human comfort. The lighting in hidden passages was minimal at best. Torches might be placed at intervals, but smoke, soot, and limited airflow made them more of a challenge than a solution. Residents often relied on small lanterns or even candles, which cast flickering shadows that could deceive the eye. In these dim, twisting corridors, it was easy to misjudge a step or trip over protruding stones, a loose brick, or a pile of discarded refuse. A fall here could be especially dangerous, as the narrow walls amplified the force of impact, and the confined space allowed no room to break a fall. Some passages were vertical, descending sharply into basements, dungeons, or cisterns. These shafts often featured ladders or primitive wooden steps. Over time, moisture and rot weakened the supports, creating an ever-present risk of collapse. One slip could send a person plummeting into darkness, where jagged rocks or debris awaited. Chroniclers from the period tell stories of castle servants who ventured down a hidden stair, only to be trapped or fatally injured when part of the wooden structure gave way. Such incidents were common enough to be almost expected in the daily life of a castle. Other passages were horizontal, but no less perilous. They sometimes ran beneath entire sections of the fortress, connecting kitchens to armories or barracks to storage rooms. The air in these tunnels could be thick with dust, mold, and the faint odor of human or animal waste. Ventilation was minimal, so even a short journey could leave one coughing or lightheaded. Rats and other vermin scurried along these corridors, adding a further layer of unpredictability and hazard. It was not uncommon for a startled servant to stumble over a hidden trapdoor or misstep on a loose stone in panic. Despite the dangers, hidden passages were highly valued. They allowed defenders to move unseen, avoid bottlenecks in hallways during attacks, or stage surprise sorties. Some passages led to the castle exterior, providing secret escape routes during sieges. For the nobility, these corridors were also a means of privacy, allowing movement between chambers without exposure to servants or intruders. But the narrow design, damp conditions, and twisting complexity meant that only those familiar with the layout could navigate them safely. Outsiders or untrained hands risked injury or worse. Beyond the physical hazards, these passages carried a psychological weight. Moving through the darkness, hearing only the echo of one's own footsteps, created an atmosphere of isolation and tension. Shadows played tricks on the mind, and the knowledge that a single misstep could lead to serious harm heightened stress. In some accounts, castle residents describe an almost claustrophobic dread when entering these corridors at night. The passages were both protective and confining, offering secrecy while demanding vigilance at every turn. The defensive design of hidden passages was often ingenious. Secret doors might swing open into narrow alcoves, or false walls might conceal an entire corridor. Trapdoors could drop intruders into pits or cellars. In some castles, the passage itself was a labyrinth, designed to confuse attackers or slow them until reinforcements could arrive. For defenders, mastery of these routes offered a tactical edge, but even the most skilled could not entirely eliminate the inherent dangers. Every twist, every step, every uneven stone posed a potential risk. Some passages were intentionally constructed with steep inclines or narrow steps to limit the number of people who could traverse them at once. This design served a strategic purpose during sieges, but compounded the physical hazards. Heavy loads, rushes of water, or a momentary lapse in concentration could send someone tumbling. These narrow confines also amplified the sound of footsteps, echoing eerily and creating an almost sensory trap, where the slightest noise seemed louder and more menacing. Despite all these dangers, the hidden passages of medieval castles were essential to their function. They allowed discreet communication, emergency escape, and strategic mobility. They were a testament to the medieval understanding of secrecy, defense, and the delicate balance between ingenuity and risk. And yet, the price for that ingenuity was ever-present narrow, dark, damp corridors that could just as easily become instruments of death as they were pathways of safety. As night fell and torches flickered in distant halls, the hidden passages of a castle remained silent witnesses to centuries of movement, accidents, and narrow escapes. Every twist and turn, every step along the uneven stone, carried the weight of history, a mixture of innovation, necessity, and quiet peril. Navigating these passages required caution, attentiveness, and respect for the subtle dangers woven into the castle's very foundations. For those who survived the hidden corridors, the experience left an indelible mark. These passages were more than architectural curiosities. They were daily reminders of the precarious nature of life in a medieval fortress. They were instruments of strategy, havens of secrecy, and silent teachers of caution. To know a castle's hidden passages was to understand its heart, its vulnerabilities, and the delicate line between safety and danger. Beneath the towering walls, beyond the grand halls and hidden passages, lay the darkest corners of a medieval castle, the dungeons. These subterranean chambers were the ultimate expression of fear, control, and the grim realities of medieval life. They were often cold, damp, and shrouded in shadows, places where the air itself seemed heavy with the weight of despair. For all their horror, The dungeons were essential to the fortress's function, both as tools of punishment and as instruments of psychological control. Yet even here, the danger extended beyond the prisoners themselves. The very design, materials, and conditions made the dungeons lethal to all who entered. Upon descending into a castle dungeon, one immediately noticed the stark contrast to the more visible parts of the fortress. Above ground, stone corridors and wooden floors offered some warmth, light, and air circulation. In the dungeons, however, the walls were unpolished. The floors often bare stone or packed earth, and the ceilings low, sometimes arched in uneven stone that trapped every echo. The cold was unrelenting, seeping into bones and dampening spirits. Moisture pooled in the corners, creating slick patches that could cause a stumble or fall. Even the act of moving through the dungeon demanded vigilance. A misplaced step could result in twisted ankles or worse. The air in dungeons was thick with the smells of decay, stagnant water, and unwashed bodies. Ventilation was poor, and windows, if any existed, were tiny arrow slits that allowed almost no light. The lack of sunlight created not only physical challenges but psychological ones. As shadows seemed to move, walls appeared to close in, and a constant chill gnawed at the senses. Chroniclers often wrote of prisoners succumbing to illness simply from prolonged exposure to these conditions. Respiratory diseases, hypothermia, and infections were common, claiming lives even without the intervention of guards or punishment. Dungeons varied in design depending on their purpose. Some were simple cells, small, enclosed rooms with thick stone walls, often no larger than a storage closet, where prisoners were left for days or weeks on end. Others were larger, more complex chambers divided by stone walls or wooden bars, sometimes equipped with iron chains or rings embedded in the walls to restrain captives. The floors were uneven, covered in dust, straw, or refuse, which added a constant risk of slips and falls. The most notorious dungeons incorporated pits or subterranean chambers, designed to terrify or physically harm. Prisoners might descend a flight of steps, only to find the floor give way slightly, plunging them into a confined space filled with foul water or debris. For those imprisoned, the dangers extended beyond disease or exposure. Starvation, dehydration, and neglect were deliberate tools of control. Food, when it came, was meager and often contaminated. Water might be drawn from the same stagnant sources that surrounded the castle, carrying with it the risk of dysentery and cholera. In some accounts, prisoners succumbed to thirst and hunger more quickly than to any physical punishment. The isolation itself was a slow, relentless peril. Hours, days, and weeks in near complete darkness could erode mental stability, leading to despair, hallucinations, and even self-harm. The architecture of the dungeons also amplified the danger. Narrow staircases and low ceilings made movement hazardous. Many dungeons were arranged in tiers or connected to hidden passages, meaning a fall could carry a prisoner from one level to another. The stone steps were often worn smooth over decades, slick with dampness or grime. Ladders, where they existed, were rickety and prone to collapse, offering no guarantee of safety. Even guards and castle staff were at risk while navigating these spaces, particularly during emergencies or when moving prisoners quickly. Iron played a central role in dungeon construction. Heavy bars, chains, and manacles were fixed into walls, ceilings, and floors, securing captives, but also creating additional hazards. Rust weakened these implements over time, and sharp edges or loose fittings could cause cuts and bruises. In many castles, the ironwork was intentionally rough, designed to punish through discomfort as much as confinement. A prisoner brushing against a chain could tear clothing, scrape skin, or exacerbate an existing injury. Guards, too, had to negotiate the same tight quarters and jagged metal, making even routine tasks potentially dangerous. Dungeons were rarely simple storage or confinement areas. They were spaces of psychological warfare. The layout often amplified sound, so screams and footsteps echoed unnaturally, making a single prisoner's fear ripple through the walls. Some chambers were designed with sloping floors or uneven surfaces to destabilize those walking or standing. Others incorporated water traps or concealed pits, where a misstep could lead to a sudden plunge into freezing water or waste. Even lighting, when present, was minimal and deliberately uneven, casting flickering shadows that disoriented and intimidated. The conditions of dungeon life often extended beyond immediate physical dangers. The lack of sunlight disrupted circadian rhythms, impairing sleep and weakening resistance to illness. The constant damp and cold eroded physical health. Disease spread rapidly in these crowded or poorly maintained spaces, and vermin carried illness into every corner. Accounts from medieval chronicles describe prisoners succumbing to fevers, pestilence, or starvation long before they were released or executed. These chronic conditions made the dungeons silent killers, as deadly in their own way as the swords, arrows, or boiling oil used to defend the castle. Yet for all their darkness, dungeons were not entirely lifeless. They were part of the broader ecosystem of the castle, connected to hidden passages, guard rooms, and the great halls above. Messages could be smuggled through tunnels. Prisoners could be moved quietly to avoid notice, and guards could maintain surveillance without being seen. For the castle's defenders, the dungeons were strategic assets, ensuring that threats could be contained, observed, or eliminated. But the risks extended to all who entered, creating a pervasive atmosphere of tension and caution. Despite the dangers, the dungeons also revealed the ingenuity and resourcefulness of medieval engineers. Carved stone steps, hidden chambers, and reinforced walls demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of structural integrity and human behavior. The design of a dungeon reflected a careful balance between control, punishment, and containment. Every wall bar and floor stone was placed with purpose. Every feature served multiple functions: security, intimidation, and, inevitably, the quiet enforcement of death by accident, neglect, or disease. As night fell within the castle, the dungeons became silent witnesses to centuries of suffering, resilience, and strategy. The shadows seemed alive, the cold more penetrating, and the echoes of footsteps more insistent. For those who lived above ground, the dungeons were a reminder of the consequences of disobedience, the fragility of life, and the meticulous planning that governed every corner of the fortress. They were the most somber spaces of the medieval world, combining architecture, psychology, and danger in ways that shaped the lives of all who entered. In reflecting on the castle's dungeons, one realizes that these chambers were not merely prisons. They were extensions of the castle's philosophy of control, defense, and survival. Every design decision, from ceiling height to floor composition, from ironwork to lighting, had ramifications for both prisoners and staff. The dungeons exemplified the delicate balance of medieval life, a blend of ingenuity, caution, and ever-present peril. They were reminders that safety and danger existed side by side, even within the very heart of stone fortresses, meant to protect life. The medieval castle, from its towering battlements to its hidden passages and subterranean dungeons, was a place where life and death intertwined. Every stone told a story, every corridor carried the echoes of the past, and every shadow reminded its residents of the precariousness of existence. The dungeons, silent and unforgiving, were the final chapter in this story, a somber reflective space where the full spectrum of medieval danger, ingenuity, and endurance came into sharpest focus. Hello and welcome, dear listener, in Rust History for Sleep. Close your eyes, take a slow breath, and imagine yourself standing at the foot of a medieval castle. The sun is setting, and the air carries the cool bite of evening. Before you rises a wall of stone, impossibly tall, its towers stretching toward the darkening sky. To the untrained eye, it might seem majestic, a monument to kings and lords, to wealth and power. But as you gaze a little longer, you notice something else. The walls do not invite you in, they repel you. Their shadow falls like a warning, and every stone whispers of danger. This is not a home in the way we think of homes today. This is a fortress, and fortresses, above all else, are built for fear. Medieval castles were designed to dominate the landscape, to remind friend and foe alike of who held power. To peasants living in villages nearby, they stood like unmovable mountains of authority, looming over the fields and forests. To enemies, they were dreadful puzzles of stone and steel, designed to exhaust, to trap, and to kill. Yet for the people who lived inside, the danger did not vanish at the closing of the gate. In many ways, it only grew sharper. The first and most important truth about castles is this: they were built for war. Every passage, every window, every stair was meant to defend against attack. But war is not tidy, and weapons of stone and iron do not care whether the target is an invader or a loyal servant. A collapsing wall crushes both alike. A fire set in the kitchens can spread just as easily to the Lord's chamber as it can to a soldier's quarters. Castles, in their grandeur, hid a secret: that they were as dangerous for those inside as for those out. Imagine yourself walking across the drawbridge. The wooden boards creak underfoot, suspended above a dark moat below. The water, thick and murky, carries the faint smell of rot. You step forward through the gatehouse, and you find yourself in a narrow tunnel. Above, hidden in the shadows, are slits in the ceiling, murder holes, where defenders could pour boiling oil, scalding water, or rocks upon intruders. Even now, centuries later, the stones feel heavy with the memory of violence. Inside the courtyard, you hear the sounds of life. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the clatter of hooves in the stables, the murmur of servants carrying buckets of water. Yet behind these ordinary sounds is the awareness that you are inside a carefully designed trap. If the outer gates were ever breached, this very courtyard would turn into a killing ground. Arrows from the towers, rocks from the walls, soldiers charging down from stairways. Nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. The irony of castles lies here. The very design that kept invaders at bay also placed those who lived within constant reach of danger. Spiral staircases twisted tightly, making movement difficult and dangerous even in peaceful times. Torchlight flickered against damp stone, leaving hallways half hidden in shadow, where a single misstep could mean a fall. Wells, dug deep to provide fresh water, sometimes became poisoned, whether by accident or through sabotage during siege. Even the great feasting halls, lined with tapestries and crowded with people, could turn deadly in an instant if fire spread from a careless spark. But beyond physical danger, there was another, quieter fear. The castle was an island of stone, cut off from the outside world. When war came, gates closed, bridges rose, and the people inside became prisoners of their own fortress. Supplies dwindled, sickness spread, and the weight of silence pressed down on every soul. Imagine the cold of winter seeping through stone walls, the smoke of hearth fires trapped in narrow rooms, the sound of coughing echoing through the corridors. These were not the fairy tale castles of bedtime stories. These were fortresses of fear. And yet, as you stand in the courtyard, you can also feel why people revered them. For all their danger, castles represented strength. They were the beating hearts of medieval power. Places where kings and lords made their stands, where families huddled together in the safety of walls, where banners snapped proudly in the wind. The danger was constant, but so was the pride. To live within a castle was to be at the center of history itself, where every moment balanced on the edge between life and death. As night falls, you walk through the narrow corridors, your footsteps echoing softly. You run your hand along the cold stone wall and imagine the countless hands that brushed against it before yours. Soldiers, servants, kings, queens, prisoners, each one carrying their own fear, their own story. The torches burn low, shadows stretch long, and the truth of the castle becomes clear. It was never built for peace. It was built as a weapon, and weapons, no matter how beautiful, are never safe. So as you drift deeper into rest, let your mind linger on this paradox. Castles were symbols of power, yet they carried death in their stones. They promised safety, yet they trapped those who relied on them most. In the chapters to come, we will explore these paradoxes more closely, walking step by step through the death traps hidden within their walls. But for now, as your breath slows and your body softens into sleep, remember this: the fortress you imagine, majestic and awe-inspiring, was also a fortress of fear, a place where power and peril were carved into the same stone. Picture yourself once again at the edge of a medieval stronghold. The castle looms ahead, a jagged silhouette against the pale light of dawn. The mist hangs heavy over the fields, curling around the base of the walls like a shroud. The villagers have already begun their morning routines. A farmer drives his sheep along the muddy path. A woman bends low to fill a jug from the stream, and a child gazes up at the towers with wide, uncertain eyes. The castle dominates every glance, every thought, every story whispered in the village. It is not just a building, it is a presence, a shadow that never leaves. For a traveler arriving in these lands, the first impression of a castle was unforgettable. Long before one crossed the drawbridge, its very outline told a story. The towers were tall, not merely to see far, but to be seen. Their jagged battlements declared power. Their sheer walls dared any enemy to come closer. Even the color of the stone, gray, weathered, and unyielding, spoke of permanence, as though the castle had risen from the earth itself. To approach was to feel small, humbled, and reminded that authority did not dwell in words alone, but in stone, iron, and height. Now imagine yourself walking toward the gates. Every step along the narrow, winding path is deliberate. The road bends, not for convenience, but to prevent any charging force from gaining momentum. As you near, the details grow sharper. The heavy oak doors, banded with black iron, are scarred with marks from weather and war. Above them, a wooden portcullis rests in its grooves, ready to drop at the first sign of trouble. To you, it may seem like an obstacle. To the lord within, it is the line between life and death. The villagers who live beneath the shadow of the castle know this impression well. To them, the sight of the walls means protection during times of invasion or raid. Yet it also means duty, for with the Lord's protection comes the expectation of service, taxes, and sometimes blood. The first impression of a castle is not one of welcome, but of command. You are not entering a home. You are entering a world where rules are unbending, where life is ordered by hierarchy, and where the stones themselves seem to whisper, "Obey." As you step onto the drawbridge, your heart quickens. The planks echo beneath your feet, each sound swallowed by the moat below. The water, dark and sluggish, reflects a distorted image of the walls above. For attackers, this moat was an obstacle, filled with mud, brambles, or even sharpened stakes. For residents, it was a daily reminder that their home was designed first for defense and second for comfort. Crossing it feels like crossing a boundary, not just from outside to inside, but from freedom into control. The gatehouse looms above. Narrow slits pierce the stone like watchful eyes. Guards stand at attention, their faces half hidden by helmets. They scan you, assessing whether you belong or whether you are a threat. Above your head, unseen, are murder holes. They are silent now, but in times of danger, they could rain down death, stones, boiling oil, arrows, upon those below. Even in peace, they remain a quiet threat, shaping the impression that safety here is built on fear. Inside the gate, the atmosphere shifts. The air smells of smoke and damp stone. The courtyard stretches wide, but it is no place of leisure. Horses stamp and snort in the stables. Blacksmiths hammer red, hot iron. Servants rush past with baskets and buckets. The first impression of life within the walls is not one of luxury, but of labor. Everyone has a task, from stable boy to cook, from knight polishing his armor to maid tending the fires. The castle, for all its grandeur, is a machine of survival. Still, there is awe. The great hall, with its banners fluttering and its tapestries glowing in the firelight, impresses even the most skeptical traveler. The long tables stretch beneath a timbered roof, the high seat of the lord or king elevated on a dais. Here, power is not only displayed but performed. Every gesture of the lord, every word of the herald, every glance exchanged among courtiers is part of the first impression intended to shape loyalty and command respect. And yet, the longer you stand in this place, the more you notice what lies behind the grandeur. The draught that creeps through the cracks in the stone. The flickering torches that leave half the corridors in shadow. The dampness that seeps into the air, clinging to your clothes and hair. The castle, magnificent in its appearance, reveals its true nature the longer one looks, a place where life is hard, where comfort is scarce, and where the stone that inspires awe also traps its people in unyielding walls. This was the dual nature of a castle's first impression. To outsiders, it was majesty. To villagers, it was authority. To invaders, it was terror. And to those who lived within, it was both sanctuary and prison. Every tower, every stair, every room carried this contradiction. The impression was unforgettable. But it was not simple. So as you lie back now, allowing your mind to drift with the rhythm of these words, imagine yourself once more at the threshold. The drawbridge creaks beneath your steps. The walls rise above like giants of stone, and the shadow of the fortress falls across your shoulders. The impression it leaves is not fleeting. It settles deep, as heavy as the stones themselves. For castles were not meant to charm. They were meant to endure. And in enduring, they carved their image upon all who beheld them. Imagine you are standing before the gates of a medieval castle. The drawbridge has lowered with a groan, and the heavy oak doors, bound with iron, swing open slowly to admit you. At first, there is a sense of relief. You are inside, away from the uncertain dangers of the open road, beyond the cold eyes of archers who peer from the battlements. But very quickly, another feeling creeps in, something less comforting. Something that makes you realize this welcome is not as gentle as it seems. A medieval castle was not built for hospitality. It was a fortress, and its very design ensured that any visitor, friend or foe, was reminded of their vulnerability. Every feature inside the gatehouse was carefully designed to trap, confuse, and, if necessary, destroy intruders. The welcome was deadly, and it was deliberate. As you step past the threshold, you pass under the portcullis, the heavy lattice of iron, an oak suspended just above your head. It looks harmless in its resting place, but the grooves carved deep into the stone walls reveal how swiftly it could fall. In a heartbeat, the portcullis could slam down, sealing you inside the gate passage like a rat in a trap. Many intruders met their end in this narrow space, caught between the outer and inner gates with no way out. Look up, and you see small square openings in the ceiling, the infamous murder holes. To the casual eye, they may appear like harmless gaps in the stonework, but in times of siege, defenders would use them to pour boiling water, scalding oil, or even molten lead upon those trapped below. Stones, arrows, or burning pitch could rain down, turning the confined passage into a place of chaos and agony. Even if no liquid or fire was used, the mere existence of these holes served a psychological purpose. You knew, the moment you stepped through, that you were at the mercy of those above. The gate passage itself was long and deliberately narrow, forcing anyone entering to walk single file. The floor might be uneven, sometimes laid with slippery cobblestones or strewn with obstacles. Defenders knew that confusion was a weapon. The tighter and more constricted the space, the easier it was to pick off enemies one by one. On either side of you, narrow slits pierce the stone. These are arrow loops, designed so defenders can fire at intruders while remaining nearly invisible. A man standing outside sees only darkness, but within, an archer can see clearly. He draws his bow, aims, and lets fly. The shaft whistles through the slit, striking without warning. Even if you were lucky enough to have a shield, the angles of the loops allowed arrows to be shot from multiple directions. Finding the smallest gap in your defense, the sense of being watched never leaves you. The guards above, hidden behind stone and timber, are faceless and silent. Their presence is felt in every echoing footstep, every flicker of shadow across the wall. You realize that you are not walking freely. You are moving under constant scrutiny. A guest only so long as the Lord wills it. Even if you were no enemy, the welcome could still be suffocating. Diplomats, messengers, and traders who entered castles would feel the weight of these defenses pressing down on them. The message was clear. You are inside because we allow it, and we can end your life as quickly as we granted you passage. Hospitality was always balanced by intimidation. Once through the inner gates, you might expect relief. But the courtyard you enter is not much more forgiving. It is an open space, true, but still designed with defense in mind. The ground may be sloped, so that invaders struggled to gain footing. Towers loom above, each one a vantage point for archers or stone throwers. Even the stairways and doors around the yard are designed to confuse outsiders, leading them in circles while defenders regroup. In the rare case of an actual attack, the welcome turned lethal in seconds. The portcullis dropped, the inner doors slammed shut, and anyone trapped in the gatehouse was cut down. Boiling liquids seared flesh, arrows pierced armor, and soldiers stationed in hidden chambers charged forth with swords drawn. Many sieges ended before they truly began. Not because the attackers lacked courage, but because the castle's first line of defense broke them. But for all this, there was another side to the deadly welcome. For those loyal to the Lord, for villagers who sought shelter during raids, the same defenses offered reassurance. The portcullis was not just a trap, it was a shield. The arrow loops did not only menace strangers, they promised protection. The deadly welcome, terrifying to enemies, was a lifeline to allies. To step inside meant survival, even if comfort was scarce. The symbolism of the gatehouse went beyond battle. It was the threshold between two worlds, the chaotic, lawless countryside outside and the ordered, hierarchical world within. To enter meant submitting to authority, acknowledging the power of the Lord who ruled there. Guests, allies, and even nobles understood that they crossed not just a physical boundary, but a social one. The castle welcomed them, but it did so on its own terms, under its own rules, with its own unspoken threats. As night falls in our imagined castle, the gates close once more. The drawbridge creaks as it rises, the portcullis lowers with a heavy thud, and the iron bolts slide into place. The torches flicker in the gatehouse, casting shadows on the stone. Outside, the world is dangerous and uncertain. Inside, the air is heavy, watchful, and still. For those allowed within, there is safety, but it is a safety that always comes with an edge. And so the first impression lingers. A castle's welcome is not the warmth of an open hearth or the embrace of a host. It is the calculated chill of stone walls and silent guards, the whispered promise of both protection and peril. To step inside is to accept both, knowing that in this place, hospitality and hostility are separated by the thinnest of lines. So now, as you close your eyes, let the echoes of that deadly passage fade into quiet. The creak of the drawbridge, the thud of the portcullis, the hiss of an arrow loosed from a hidden slit, let them soften, becoming distant and dreamlike. You are safe here. Not as an intruder, but as a traveler in imagination. The castle's deadly welcome has played out, and in its wake remains only the steady rhythm of breath, the slow drift of thought, and the peace of sleep. Stone has no voice, and yet, in a medieval castle, the walls seem to whisper their own stories. Each block, each carved arch, each echoing chamber carried the memory of those who lived, loved, suffered, and fought within. To wander through such a fortress is not only to see stone and mortar. It is to feel the presence of centuries pressing close, murmuring of past lives like faint voices drifting through time. Imagine running your hand along the cool surface of a castle wall. The stone feels smooth in places, worn by countless fingers before yours. In other spots, it is rough, scarred by weather and age. Every mark tells a story. Some are from the masons who shaped the rock, their chisels leaving lines that never faded. Others are scratches from desperate defenders, or graffiti carved by bored guards keeping long watches. The walls are not silent, they remember. Step into a great hall, and the air changes. The high, vaulted ceiling catches every sound and transforms it into something larger. When nobles once dined here, the clatter of goblets and the laughter of courtiers would have risen like a chorus, magnified by the stone. When silence reigned, the walls echoed only the crackle of fire and the shuffling of servants' feet. Even now, if you close your eyes, you might almost hear those faint echoes, like voices lingering long after their speakers are gone. In some castles, murals and tapestries covered the walls, not just for decoration, but to speak of power and lineage. A tapestry might show the lord's ancestors in bold color, woven into scenes of conquest or devotion. A mural might depict saints, kings, or allegories of justice and loyalty. These images told stories to all who entered, proclaiming authority and reminding visitors that the walls themselves were witnesses of greatness. Yet beneath the art, the stone still waited, patient and enduring, as if to remind both ruler and subject that flesh fades, but stone abides. If the walls of a dungeon could speak, their voices would be darker, cold, damp, and close. They absorbed the suffering of those confined within. Chains scraped against them, and desperate hands beat against them in vain attempts at freedom. In these spaces, whispers may not have been imagined but real, pleas for mercy, prayers for deliverance, groans of despair. The stone kept them all, never forgetting, never forgiving. Even centuries later, standing in a prison chamber, can make one feel the weight of those unspoken sorrows. Up in the towers, the walls carried different voices. The watchman pacing along the parapet might hum a tune to break the silence of his lonely vigil. From above, the wind pressed against the stone, moaning and sighing as if nature itself spoke through the fortress. Here, the walls whispered of vigilance, of eyes always scanning the horizon, of safety hard won through sleepless nights. Sometimes, the walls bore inscriptions that still remain today, simple names, dates, or symbols etched by passing hands. A knight waiting for a summons might scratch his crest into the stone. A servant might carve a heart, leaving a tiny piece of themselves for the future. These are voices made permanent, words carved in patience, telling us that even in places of grandeur and war, the human need to leave a mark endured. But the strongest voice of castle walls was in their silence. For all the noise they had contained, battles, banquets, prayers, executions, stone has a way of quieting the past, distilling it into stillness. Walk alone through an abandoned hall and you feel it, the hush that settles, heavy and eternal. It is not emptiness, but presence, an unspoken reminder that you are but one among countless others who have stood here before. Think of a castle in winter. Snow piles up against the outer walls, muffling sound. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackles faintly. Outside, the wind hurls itself against the battlements, but the stone holds fast. The walls seem to hum with endurance, as if they are saying, "We have seen storms before, we will see them again, we do not break." In their strength lies a kind of reassurance, even across centuries. And yet, walls are not only barriers, they are storytellers. They tell of masons who risked their lives to build them, of lords who dreamed of security, of queens who found fleeting peace behind them, and of children who played in their shadow. They tell of arrows striking, of torches flickering, of songs sung in forgotten tongues. Each layer of stone, each scar of battle, each mark of time is a sentence in an unending chronicle written without ink or parchment. So when we say the walls of a castle speak, it is not a metaphor only. They do speak in ways beyond words, through their endurance, their silence, their scars, and their whispers in the wind. To listen is not to strain your ears, but to open your imagination, to let the echoes of history brush against your mind like soft voices in a dream. And as you listen now, in this quiet moment, let the walls speak gently to you. Hear the distant echoes of laughter, the faint murmur of prayer, the sigh of the wind against stone. Let it all blend together into a lullaby of history, timeless, steady, reassuring. The voices are not meant to alarm but to soothe, reminding you that time stretches long, that stone endures, and that you too are part of a story far larger than yourself. Let the sound fade now into stillness. Imagine yourself lying safely within those stone walls, a quiet chamber, a fire's glow, a heavy door closed against the night. The walls keep watch, as they always have. Their voices soften into silence, and in that silence, you drift gently toward rest. A crown glitters in the light, heavy with gold and jewels. And yet the weight it places on the head of a king is heavier than any treasure. To rule in medieval times was not merely to sit on a throne and bask in admiration. It was to shoulder a burden of responsibility, fear, and endless expectation. The king was both man and symbol, caught between the frailty of human life and the unyielding demands of divine authority. Imagine, for a moment, being a medieval king. You awaken at dawn not to leisure, but to duty. The first sound might be the tolling of a church bell, reminding you that your power is not your own, but bestowed by God. Before you have even risen, the weight of decision already presses down upon you. Farmers await justice in disputes, nobles plot their ambitions, and envoys from distant lands seek your word on matters that could mean war or peace. A king does not rise slowly into the day. He wakes beneath the crown, whether it rests on his head or not. The image of kingship was carefully cultivated, but behind the ceremonies lay a very human man. Royal portraits and chronicles showed grandeur, but the reality was often exhaustion. A king might spend hours hearing petitions, listening to grievances, and judging cases that ranged from theft of livestock to accusations of treason. Each ruling carried consequences. To be too lenient risked appearing weak. To be too harsh risked stirring rebellion. The burden lay in knowing that every choice rippled far beyond the courtroom, shaping the trust or resentment of thousands. And then there were the nobles. A medieval king was rarely absolute, despite the aura of divine right. Powerful barons, dukes, and earls often commanded armies of their own, and their loyalty was as fragile as it was essential. A king carried the burden of constant negotiation, offering lands, titles, or marriages to secure allegiance, while remaining wary of betrayal. To sit at a banquet among smiling lords was to wonder which of them sharpened daggers beneath their cloaks. The burden of kingship was also physical. Leading armies into battle was not optional. It was expected. A king was meant to embody courage, to be seen at the front lines, even if it meant risking capture or death. Imagine the pressure of donning armor, not only for yourself, but for the morale of an entire kingdom. Soldiers looked to the king as their living banner. If he faltered, they faltered. If he fell, chaos often followed. Thus, the crown was not only heavy, it was perilous. Yet even in moments of triumph, the burden did not lift. Victories brought expectations of generosity to followers and merciless punishment to enemies. Defeat, on the other hand, could destroy a dynasty overnight. Kings lived in constant awareness that fortune was fickle, and that the same walls that echoed their cheers could one day resound with rebellion. Family life, too, was not free of the crown's weight. A king's marriage was rarely his own choice. It was a contract between kingdoms, a tool of diplomacy. His children were not simply loved as sons and daughters. They were pawns in the great chessboard of dynastic politics. A daughter might be married off to cement an alliance, sent to a foreign land never to return. A son's birth brought joy, but also tension. Would he live long enough to secure the throne? Many did not, leaving fathers haunted by loss, while still carrying the burden of governance. Religion deepened the load. Medieval kings were seen as God's chosen rulers, anointed in holy ceremonies that marked their power as sacred. This brought not only privilege, but a crushing sense of accountability. To fail in leadership was not merely a political misstep. It was a sin, a betrayal of divine trust. Many kings spent restless nights fearing damnation, wondering whether their wars, taxes, and judgments truly served God's will, or merely their own survival. And yet, despite the hardship, the image of kingship had to remain serene. A king could not publicly show doubt, despair, or fear to his people. He was the embodiment of stability. Even in illness, he might appear in public, supported by attendants, simply to reassure the kingdom that the crown was unshaken. To be king was to wear a mask at all times, a mask of authority, wisdom, and invincibility, while the man beneath bore all the weight in silence. Consider the nights within the castle chambers. After the banquets ended, after the petitions ceased, after the guards closed the doors, the king might sit alone. The crown removed, the robes set aside, only the man remained, tired, thoughtful, perhaps even frightened. He might pray before a small chapel candle, asking for guidance. He might stare at maps, tracing borders with wary fingers, knowing that lines on parchment meant lives in reality. He might lie awake, the silence of the night pressing against him, as heavily as the voices of his advisors during the day. This was the true burden of kingship, the loneliness of command. Few could understand, fewer still could share it. Even trusted advisors had their ambitions. Even family members could turn rivals. A king might be surrounded by courtiers, but in the deepest matters of rule, he was alone. The walls that seemed to protect him could also feel like a prison, echoing with the knowledge that every decision, every mistake, bore his name alone. And yet, the crown endured. Kings bore the weight not only for themselves, but for the continuity of their realm. They carried the burden so that others could sleep in safety behind castle walls, so that trade could flow, so that fields could be plowed, so that faith could flourish. It was not always noble, nor always just, but it was always heavy. So when you think of medieval kings, do not imagine only the glitter of jewels or the splendor of processions. Imagine instead the weary man beneath the crown, rising each morning to face the burden anew. Imagine the silence of his chamber, the press of responsibility, the endless choices that carved his fate. And as you drift now into rest, let that image soften, not of grandeur, but of humanity. For the king's burden, heavy though it was still carried by a human heart, beating much like your own. Behind the glittering crown of a king often stood a queen, sometimes revered, sometimes overlooked, but always present. Her role, though cloaked in ceremony and expectation, was rarely simple. Medieval queens lived in the shadows of power, their lives woven with influence, sacrifice, and silent endurance. Though the chronicles often celebrated kings and warriors, the story of queens is one of quiet strength, resilience, and the art of surviving within the narrow walls of duty. Imagine a queen's morning in a medieval castle. She wakes in a chamber lined with stone walls, perhaps softened by tapestries depicting saints or hunting scenes. Servants move quietly, preparing garments of silk, wool, or fur, depending on the season. Though her attire radiates elegance, every layer serves as a reminder of status, wealth, and the image she must project. To the outside world, she is majesty personified. Yet beneath the fabric lies a woman bound by roles she did not choose. Marriage defined much of a queen's life. Unlike ordinary unions, royal marriages were rarely born of affection. Instead, they were contracts written in bloodlines and sealed in treaties. A queen might leave her homeland at a young age, traveling across mountains or seas, to wed a man she had never met, speaking a language she did not know. Her wedding was not just a personal milestone. It was a diplomatic act that could prevent wars or secure alliances. The joy or sorrow of her union mattered less than its political value. And yet, within those arranged marriages, queens often carved spaces of influence. Many became trusted advisors to their husbands, speaking softly in chambers where they could not shout in council halls. A queen's words, whispered at night or during quiet walks, could shape decisions of state. Some kings listened closely, valuing their wives as partners in rule. Others ignored them, pushing them into the shadows where their power became more subtle, woven into friendships with courtiers, clergy, or foreign envoys. Above all, a queen's worth in the eyes of her kingdom often rested upon one expectation: producing heirs. The pressure to bear sons was relentless, a demand as heavy as the crown itself. Every pregnancy carried risk. Many queens suffered loss or illness, yet they endured for the sake of dynastic survival. A single healthy son could secure peace for decades, while the absence of one could plunge kingdoms into chaos. The weight of succession pressed down upon her body and soul, leaving little room for personal choice. But queens were more than vessels for heirs. They were patrons of culture, guardians of tradition, and symbols of piety. Many commissioned churches, hospitals, or monasteries, binding their legacy to acts of devotion. Their faith was not merely private, it was public, a performance of holiness that reassured subjects of divine favor. In court, they presided over rituals, feasts, and ceremonies, embodying dignity even when their hearts were weary. To falter in grace was to invite whispers. To maintain composure was to strengthen the throne itself. Queens also navigated dangers invisible to many. Courtly intrigue swirled around them, fueled by envy, rivalry, and suspicion. A smile given too freely, a friendship misinterpreted, or a rumor whispered could spark scandal. Queens lived beneath constant scrutiny, their lives dissected by courtiers eager to find flaws. A misplaced step could erode their reputation, and with it, their influence. They had to master the art of diplomacy, not only across nations, but within the fragile ecosystem of their own court. Some queens transcended the shadows, leaving indelible marks upon history. Eleanor of Aquitaine commanded respect as a duchess in her own right, accompanying her husbands on crusades and ruling vast territories. Empress Matilda fought for her rightful crown, enduring civil war to defend her claim. Others, less remembered, wielded power quietly, through correspondence, careful alliances, or the education of their children. Their strength was not always measured in battles won, but in endurance, survival, and the legacy they secured for future generations. Consider the loneliness that often accompanied their roles. While kings traveled on campaigns or councils, queens remained in castles, managing households and raising children. Though surrounded by attendants, they could feel isolated, caught between duty to their husband, expectations of their people, and memories of the homeland they had left behind. Letters became lifelines, carrying fragments of affection, grief, or hope across great distances. In the silence of their chambers, queens bore burdens unseen, their struggles hidden behind veils of ceremony. And yet, despite the shadows, queens held a unique kind of power. They shaped the courtly culture of refinement, courtesy, and chivalry that defined much of the medieval world. They modeled ideals of womanhood for noble families, balancing grace with resilience. They inspired poetry, songs, and legends that cast them as heroines, saints, or sometimes villains. Through their presence, they softened the harshness of war and governance, reminding kings and courtiers alike that, behind the iron of the sword, lay the softness of human ties. At night, when the castle corridors grew still, a queen might sit before a flickering candle, reflecting on the day. Perhaps she prayed for strength, for her children, or for peace in a kingdom that rarely knew it. Perhaps she thought of her youth, the freedom she had left behind, and wondered what might have been had she not been chosen for the crown. Or perhaps she accepted her fate with quiet dignity, understanding that her story was not only her own, but bound to the destiny of nations. So as you drift deeper into rest, let the image of the medieval queen linger, not as a figure of fairy tale perfection, nor as a forgotten shadow, but as a woman of flesh and spirit, balancing expectation, duty, and quiet strength. Behind every throne was such a figure, carrying her own invisible crown, often heavier than the one forged of gold. In the grand halls of medieval castles, where banners fluttered and minstrels played, the figure of the royal heir loomed large. To be a prince in these times was to live a life wrapped in privilege, but also in pressure, a childhood overshadowed by destiny. Unlike the carefree lives of many children in the villages beyond the castle walls, a prince's every moment was shaped by expectation, preparation, and the constant reminder that one day, the weight of the crown would rest upon his head. Imagine the early years of a young prince, From his very first breath, his arrival was celebrated with ringing bells, lavish feasts, and solemn prayers of thanksgiving. Unlike daughters, whose births were often met with polite but restrained joy, the birth of a son was heralded as a triumph of dynastic continuity. His tiny cries echoed as a reassurance to the kingdom. The line would endure, and the future seemed secure. But childhood for a prince was never simply about play. From the moment he could walk, his training began. Tutors surrounded him, drilling him in the essentials of language, scripture, and law. Latin was often a requirement, as it was the tongue of scholars and the church. He learned to read and recite holy texts, to compose letters, and to understand the intricacies of governance. His lessons were not just academic. They were rehearsals for rulership. Every page of parchment, every memorized verse, every carefully drawn coat of arms prepared him for the stage of kingship. Beyond the classroom, martial training awaited him. While scholars taught the pen, knights taught the sword. From wooden play weapons in childhood to heavy steel blades in adolescence, the prince was expected to master the arts of combat. Horsemanship, jousting, archery, and the discipline of wearing armor became daily practice. A future king could not simply command armies from afar. He was expected to embody the valor of chivalry, to inspire men through personal example. His body was molded as much as his mind, conditioned for the battles he might one day lead. Yet beneath the drills and duties lay immense pressure. A prince was never free from comparison. Measured against the legacy of his ancestors, weighed against the expectations of his people. Every misstep, every sign of weakness could be magnified, whispered about in corridors or chronicled by monks. In moments of failure, a boy might feel the crushing weight of destiny before he even reached manhood. His laughter, his tears, his mistakes were not solely his own. They belonged to the image of kingship. Family life was equally complex. While the queen, his mother, often played a tender role in shaping his early years, fathers, especially kings, could be stern, distant, and demanding. Some princes grew up in awe of their fathers, striving desperately to live up to their examples. Others resented them, creating rivalries that sometimes spilled into rebellion. The throne was a prize so alluring, and yet so perilous that it could divide even blood itself. Brothers might become allies or enemies, their bonds tested by succession disputes that turned kinship into rivalry. The path of an heir was rarely straightforward. Disease could strike at any moment, snuffing out young lives and plunging dynasties into crisis. At times, an eldest son might die unexpectedly, forcing younger siblings into roles they had never been groomed for. In other cases, questions of legitimacy arose, with rivals challenging the right of a prince to inherit. The crown, though gleaming, was never guaranteed. It had to be secured through health, loyalty, and the constant reinforcement of rightful authority. Consider the loneliness of such a life. While noble children from other families might have freedom to roam forests or indulge in youthful games, the heir was watched closely, guarded by attendants and shielded from undue risk. His friendships were often political, shaped by alliances and arranged fosterings rather than choice. A boy might crave the simple joys of anonymity, but his identity was never his own. He belonged to the realm. As adolescence gave way to manhood, expectations only grew sharper. A prince was encouraged to show wisdom in council, courage on the battlefield, and restraint in matters of personal conduct. Even his marriage was arranged with strategy in mind, uniting him with a bride who brought wealth, alliances, or legitimacy. His personal desires mattered little compared to the needs of the realm. In many ways, his destiny was written long before he had the chance to shape it. Yet history reminds us that not all princes bore these pressures in the same way. Some rose nobly to the challenge, becoming legendary kings whose reigns defined eras. Others faltered, crushed by the expectations or undone by their own flaws. Some heirs never reached the throne at all, their lives cut short by illness, accident, or intrigue. The story of the heir was always precarious, a tightrope walk between privilege and peril. Still, princes carried within them the hope of their people. To peasants laboring in the fields, the image of a bright young heir promised continuity and stability. To courtiers, he represented opportunity and the chance for favor in a new reign. To foreign rulers, he was a potential ally, or a rival to be watched closely. His very existence rippled across borders and generations. And so, as you drift towards sleep, picture the young prince standing in the courtyard of a great castle. The clang of practiced swords echoes around him, the scent of horses lingers in the air, and the stern voice of his tutor calls for focus. Yet in his eyes, there is both determination and wariness. The gaze of a child carrying the future of a kingdom upon his shoulders. His journey is not just his own, but the story of every heir who ever walked the narrow path toward a throne. Let this image settle softly in your thoughts, the prince. Not as a distant figure of privilege, but as a boy and a man caught between expectation and identity. His story, like so many others in medieval times, reminds us that even within castles, life was never simple. The story of kingship has never been only about ruling. It has always been about inheriting. Every monarch's reign carried with it the shadow of the future, for no king was eternal. And when the moment of transition came, the delicate question of succession determined whether peace prevailed or chaos swallowed the land. Succession in the medieval world was not the smooth and orderly process we might imagine from the pageantry of coronations. It was fraught with tension, uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of violence. The death of a king was more than the passing of one man. It was the opening of a doorway, and what lay on the other side could be stability or ruin. Imagine a medieval kingdom at the moment of a sovereign's death. Bells might toll through a darkened city, their mournful sound carrying across rooftops and into the countryside. Courtiers whispered in dimly lit chambers, each weighing their loyalties carefully. Messengers galloped through muddy roads, carrying news of the king's death to distant castles. And everywhere, people asked the same question: who would rule them now? In theory, the answer was simple. The crown was hereditary. A king's eldest son would inherit the throne, ensuring a neat continuity from one generation to the next. But in practice, life was rarely so tidy. What if the heir was too young, still a child in need of guidance? What if there were multiple sons, each with his own claim and his own supporters? What if the king had daughters, nieces, or nephews, and rival families saw an opportunity to assert their own rights? Each of these questions carried within it the seeds of conflict. Consider the story of Henry II of England. A powerful king, he built an empire that stretched across much of France and the British Isles. But when it came time for succession, he left behind more than wealth and territory. He left behind a family riddled with rivalry. His sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, each believed himself destined for greatness. Their ambitions clashed like swords in the dark. Even while Henry still lived, his sons rebelled against him, eager to secure their share of power before their father's death. And when Henry finally passed, his legacy was not calm succession, but years of strife and shifting alliances. For every kingdom, succession was both a moment of vulnerability and of hope. A young king might be hailed as the dawn of a new age, his coronation celebrated with music, feasting, and proclamations of renewal. Yet behind the bright banners and solemn rituals, there lingered the knowledge that every succession was a gamble. A capable ruler might carry the kingdom to new heights, but an inept or weak king could plunge it into decline. The ceremonies of coronation were designed to conceal this uncertainty. In the great cathedrals where kings were anointed, every gesture carried symbolic weight. The act of placing a crown upon a monarch's head was not merely political. It was sacred. The oil with which he was anointed marked him as chosen by God. The people gathered in hushed reverence, as if the divine hand itself had reached down to bless the new sovereign. But beneath the sacred words and solemn chants, political realities remained unchanged. Rival factions still watched closely. Ambitious nobles still sharpened their swords. Some successions spiraled into open conflict. The Wars of the Roses in 15th century England stand as a grim reminder of this. Two rival branches of the royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York, both claimed the crown. For decades, England was torn apart by battles, betrayals, and sudden reversals of fortune. Kings were crowned and dethroned in rapid succession, their reigns ending not with peaceful funerals, but with violent deaths on the battlefield or execution at the block. For the people living through those years, succession was not a lofty matter of dynasties. It was a storm that uprooted their lives and left the kingdom in ruins. But even when war did not break out, the burden of succession weighed heavily on those who inherited thrones. A young man crowned king might suddenly find himself responsible for decisions far beyond his years. At 15 or 16, he might command armies, oversee vast treasuries, and stand as the final arbiter of justice for thousands of people. The crown was glittering, yes, but it pressed down like iron on the head of its wearer. There are stories of kings who cracked under this pressure. Some became reclusive, retreating from the court into private chambers, where they could escape the endless demands of governance. Others became tyrannical, lashing out at perceived enemies, determined to secure their power by fear if not by love. Still others simply faltered, allowing their advisors to rule in their stead, while the young monarch became little more than a figurehead. And yet, not all tales of succession are grim. There were heirs who rose nobly to the challenge, who took the burdens left to them and turned them into opportunities for greatness. Think of Richard the Lionheart, who inherited not just a kingdom, but also his father's wars and debts. He carried the burden of kingship onto the battlefields of the Crusades, earning his place in history as both a warrior and a ruler of legendary courage. Still, even Richard's story reminds us of succession's dual nature. When he died without leaving a legitimate heir, the crown passed to his brother John, a king whose reign was marked by rebellion, humiliation, and the eventual sealing of Magna Carta. From one succession to the next, the fortunes of a kingdom could swing dramatically, reminding everyone that the fate of nations often turned on the uncertain thread of inheritance. For those who lived inside the castles and towns of the Middle Ages, the burden of succession was not distant politics. It was a reality that touched their lives in ways both subtle and direct. A stable succession might bring peace, fair taxation, and predictable laws. A contested one might mean burned villages, hungry winters, and the constant fear of soldiers marching across their fields. As we drift deeper into this tale, picture once more the medieval world at that fragile moment after a king's death. The old ruler lies in state, candles flickering around his bier. Nobles gather in hushed groups, speaking in careful tones. Outside, peasants look toward the castle, wondering what tomorrow will bring. And somewhere, in the quiet of his chamber, a new king prepares to step forward, to take up the crown, and with it the immense burden of succession. The crown was never just gold and jewels. It was a weight of history, expectation, and danger. And whether it lifted kingdoms to glory or dragged them into ruin depended not only on the man who wore it, but on the fragile, perilous path by which it came to rest upon his head. When we think of medieval queens, the images that come to mind are often drawn from fairy tales, radiant women in glittering gowns, sitting beside kings on golden thrones, or walking gracefully through candlelit halls. Yet behind the romance of storybooks lay a more complex and sometimes difficult reality. Queens were not simply ornamental figures at court. They were central to the very fabric of medieval monarchy. A queen was, above all, a partner in the project of kingship. Her role was woven into the survival of dynasties, the maintenance of alliances, and the rhythm of daily life within the castle. Though her power was often quieter than that of her husband, it was no less essential. Where kings ruled with swords and decrees, queens shaped history through influence, diplomacy, and the subtler art of persuasion. From the moment she married into a royal family, a queen became a symbol. Her marriage was rarely a matter of love. More often, it was a carefully arranged political union, designed to bind two kingdoms together or to prevent a war. A queen brought with her a dowry, connections, and sometimes entire armies of allies. Her very presence at court was a daily reminder of treaties signed, oaths sworn, and promises of peace. Take, for example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous queens of the Middle Ages. Through her marriages, she was both Queen of France and later Queen of England, linking powerful kingdoms across Europe. Eleanor's political influence was immense. She advised her husbands, supported her sons in their claims, and left a legacy as one of the most formidable women of her age. Hers was not a life lived in the background, but at the heart of power. Still, for every Eleanor, there were countless queens whose names have been forgotten, women who carried their burdens quietly. Their most important duty was to secure the future of the dynasty by producing heirs. Royal childbirth was both an intimate and profoundly public act. A queen's fertility was watched anxiously by courtiers and chroniclers alike. With every pregnancy, hopes rose that she might bear a healthy son who would secure the line of succession. Failure to do so could bring whispers of blame, accusations of weakness, or even calls for annulment. The queen's body, in a sense, belonged not only to herself but to the kingdom. When she gave birth, it was often in the presence of witnesses, to prevent rumors of swapped infants or illegitimacy. The chamber would be filled with attendants, midwives, and sometimes even members of the court, all watching as the continuation of the dynasty came into the world. In those moments, a queen's private life was laid bare in service of the crown. Beyond motherhood, queens were also guardians of culture and faith. They patronized monasteries, commissioned works of art, and supported the education of their children. Many queens were deeply religious, serving as moral exemplars in their courts. Some acted as protectors of the poor, distributing alms and endowing hospitals. Their piety was not only personal, it was political. A devout queen lent legitimacy to her husband's reign and reinforced the idea that monarchy itself was a sacred institution. At court, queens often served as intermediaries. Nobles who feared the king's anger might approach the queen instead, asking her to intercede on their behalf. In this way, she softened the harsher edges of kingship, acting as a bridge between ruler and ruled. Chronicles are filled with stories of queens kneeling before their husbands, pleading for mercy on behalf of subjects or prisoners. Whether such gestures were spontaneous or carefully staged, they gave the impression of balance, the king as stern judge, the queen as merciful advocate. Some queens ruled in their own right, either as regents for young sons or as sovereigns outright. Empress Matilda, for example, fought fiercely for her claim to the English throne during a time of civil war. Though her struggle was marked by setbacks, her determination paved the way for her son, Henry VI, to secure the crown. Isabella of Castile, though later than the high medieval period, offers another example of a queen whose leadership reshaped history. In moments of crisis, queens could step into the spotlight, proving that monarchy was not always a man's domain. Yet life as a queen was not without peril. Intrigue at court could turn deadly. A queen who failed to maintain favor with her husband risked isolation, humiliation, or exile. Some queens were accused of witchcraft, adultery, or treason, charges that could lead to imprisonment or worse. The higher their status, the sharper the dangers that surrounded them. Despite these risks, the image of queenship endured as one of dignity and majesty. Queens were crowned and anointed in elaborate ceremonies. Their authority recognized not only as wives of kings, but as figures in their own right. They wore crowns heavy with jewels, their garments rich with embroidery and gold thread. Their presence at courtly banquets, tournaments, and religious festivals was a reminder of the balance and completeness of kingship. Without a queen, a king was seen as incomplete, lacking the fullness of rule that a royal consort provided. For the people of the Middle Ages, queens were both distant and familiar. They lived lives of unimaginable luxury, surrounded by silks and servants, yet they also embodied roles. Every villager understood wife, mother, intercessor, to peasants and nobles alike. The queen's life mirrored in grand form the same duties and struggles faced by women throughout society. As night falls on our story, picture a queen seated in her chamber, a tapestry stretched across her lap. Candles flicker in tall holders, casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the castle is quiet, save for the faint sound of guards pacing the walls. She is not a fairy tale figure, but a woman of flesh and blood, wise, burdened, watchful. In her hands lies not only the thread of her embroidery, but also the thread of a kingdom's destiny. The role of queens was never simple. It was heavy with expectation, sometimes perilous, often demanding. Yet it was also essential. Through their marriages, their children, their counsel, and their quiet influence, queens shaped the medieval world in ways both seen and unseen. They were the heartbeat within the crown, steady and enduring, reminding us that behind every king's story stood the strength of a queen. When we think of medieval knights, the image is almost always vivid. Armored figures riding across green fields, lances lowered in dazzling tournaments, or riding into battle beneath fluttering banners. The knight has become one of the most enduring symbols of the Middle Ages, wrapped in myth, romance, and legend. Yet the real lives of knights were both simpler and more complicated than the stories suggest. Their shining armor concealed not only strength, but also heavy responsibilities, unspoken rules, and a lifelong struggle to live up to ideals that were often impossible to achieve. At its core, knighthood was about service. A knight was bound to serve his lord, his king, and at least in theory, God. He was not merely a soldier for hire, but a figure who represented loyalty, courage, and honor. To become a knight was a privilege, a status earned through training, ceremony, and a code that set knights apart from ordinary warriors. The journey to knighthood began in childhood. A boy destined for this path might leave his family home at the age of 7 to live in the household of a nobleman. There, he would serve first as a page, learning basic skills of courtesy, horsemanship, and weaponry. Pages fetched water, carried messages, and watched closely as older boys trained with swords and shields. By his teenage years, he might advance to the role of squire. The life of a squire was demanding. He was expected to assist a knight directly, polishing armor, maintaining weapons, saddling horses, and sometimes even following him into battle. In return, the squire absorbed everything he could from his master: the techniques of combat, the subtleties of courtly manners, and the unspoken rhythms of chivalric life. Only after years of service would he, if deemed worthy, kneel before his lord and receive the accolade of knighthood, often marked by a tap on the shoulders with a sword and an oath sworn on sacred relics. But knighthood was more than a title. It was a way of being. Knights were bound by the code of chivalry, a loose but powerful set of ideals that shaped their behavior both on and off the battlefield. This code emphasized bravery, loyalty, generosity, and protection of the weak. A knight was expected to defend the church, honor women, serve his lord faithfully, and show mercy to defeated foes. Of course, reality was rarely so perfect. Knights were human, and like all people, they fell short. Greed, ambition, and cruelty often overshadowed chivalric ideals. Chronicles of the Middle Ages are filled with accounts of knights who burned villages, plundered towns, or betrayed their lords. Still, the very existence of the code reveals something important. It was an aspiration, a guiding light that knights were meant to follow, even if they did not always succeed. Tournaments provided a stage where knights could display their skills and test their adherence to the code. These grand events were part sport, part spectacle, and part training for war. The clash of lances in the jest, the whirl of swords in melee combat, the bright colors of heraldic banners. These tournaments dazzled audiences and allowed knights to win fame and fortune. Victory in such contests could elevate a knight's reputation, attracting the attention of kings and noble families. Yet tournaments were not only about violence, they were also about honor and ritual. Knights were expected to fight with fairness, to salute their opponents, and to dedicate their efforts to a lady watching from the stands. In this way, the martial life was bound to the traditions of courtly love, weaving together violence and poetry, duty and desire. Knights also played crucial roles in the great conflicts of their age. They rode into battle during the Crusades, marched in the armies of kings, and defended castles during sieges. The sight of a line of armored knights charging across a battlefield could strike fear into enemies and inspire courage in allies. Their weapons were heavy, their armor cumbersome, but their presence symbolized the strength of medieval warfare. Beyond war, knights served as enforcers of order in their local regions. They might guard roads, protect monasteries, or escort important figures. Their loyalty tied them tightly to the feudal system, where every knight swore oaths to a lord in exchange for land or support. It was a web of duty that bound the entire medieval world together, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest king. Among the stories of knights, one theme often repeated: the idea of the knight as a protector of the helpless. Whether it was guarding pilgrims on dangerous roads or standing as champions in disputes, knights were seen as guardians of justice. This role, too, was as much an ideal as a reality. But it reflected the yearning of the age for figures who could embody strength tempered by compassion. Religious devotion also shaped knighthood. Many knights joined military orders, such as the Knights Templar or the Knights Hospitaller, blending the life of a warrior with the discipline of a monk. These men swore vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while dedicating themselves to the defense of Christendom. In them, the ideals of chivalry were sharpened into something almost sacred. Despite all of this grandeur, the life of a knight was not always comfortable. Armor was heavy, often weighing over 60 pounds, and wearing it in the heat of battle was exhausting. Horses had to be trained, fed, and armored as well, making knighthood an expensive calling. Not all knights lived in castles or dined in luxury. Many struggled to maintain their status, caught between the romantic image of knighthood and the hard realities of daily survival. As the Middle Ages progressed, the role of knights began to change. Advances in military technology, such as the longbow and gunpowder, slowly eroded the dominance of armored cavalry on the battlefield. Yet the image of the knight endured, becoming a symbol of nobility, courage, and honor that still resonates today. So as you settle deeper into rest, picture a knight preparing for the day. His armor gleams softly in the morning light, polished by the careful hands of a squire. He bows his head in prayer, then mounts his horse, the weight of steel pressing on his shoulders. Around him, banners ripple in the wind, carrying the colors of his house. He rides not only for his lord, but for ideals greater than himself: loyalty, courage, mercy, and faith. In the stillness of night, those ideals linger, a reminder that even in a world of violence and uncertainty, people sought to live by codes of honor. The knight, with his sword and shield, was not only a warrior of flesh and blood, but also a dream of what humanity might aspire to be. When we picture a medieval castle, our minds often turn to towering stone walls, moats shimmering in the sunlight, and grand halls filled with roaring fires. Castles seem like settings from fairy tales, magnificent fortresses where lords and ladies lived lives of comfort and splendor. Yet, the truth of daily life inside these walls was far more practical, and at times, far less glamorous. A castle was a home, a workplace, and above all, a symbol of security in a dangerous world. Castles rose across the landscape of medieval Europe, not only as military strongholds, but also as centers of community and governance. Their thick walls and imposing towers were designed to withstand attacks, but inside those defenses lay bustling households where dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people lived and worked together. From the noble family who ruled the estate to the servants, soldiers, craftsmen, and even entertainers, the castle was a world unto itself. For the lord and lady of the castle, mornings often began early. The lord's duties revolved around managing the lands, overseeing justice, and ensuring the defense of his territory. He might meet with advisors, hear petitions from tenants, or plan for trade and diplomacy. The lady of the castle was equally busy, though her responsibilities often centered on managing the household, supervising servants, and ensuring the smooth running of daily life. Both roles demanded diligence, for a castle was not only a residence, but also the administrative heart of the surrounding lands. The Great Hall was the heart of castle life. It was a space of many functions, at once a dining area, a courtroom, and a gathering place. By day, it echoed with voices as disputes were settled and matters of governance were addressed. By night, it was lit by flickering torches and warmed by great hearths as the household came together to dine. Meals in the hall were communal, with the lord and lady seated at a high table, while others found their places according to rank. Food in castles could be rich and varied, though it often depended on the season and the resources of the estate. Meat, bread, and ale were staples, while wealthier households enjoyed spices, wine, and delicacies imported through trade. Feasts marked special occasions, where tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, pies, cheeses, and sweetmeats. Musicians and jesters might perform as guests dined, filling the hall with music and laughter. Yet even in such moments of festivity, strict codes of etiquette were observed, reminding all of their place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of medieval society. Beyond the Great Hall, the castle contained private chambers where the noble family could find some respite. These rooms were often modest compared to modern ideas of comfort, with wooden furniture, woolen hangings, and straw, stuffed mattresses. Windows were narrow, letting in little light, and warmth depended on the fire in the hearth. Privacy was rare, for even noble families shared their chambers with servants or attendants. Still, these private rooms offered a retreat from the public life of the hall. The rhythm of daily life in a castle extended far beyond the lord's family. Servants rose early to begin their work, cooking meals in smoky kitchens, tending to livestock, cleaning chambers, and drawing water. Blacksmiths repaired weapons and tools, carpenters maintained the structure, and stonemasons were always needed to repair walls battered by weather or war. Guards patrolled the battlements, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of danger, while messengers carried news across the estate. Children of noble birth grew up in this environment, often surrounded by tutors and attendants. Boys learned the skills needed for knighthood, riding, hunting, and the basics of warfare, while girls were taught household management, religious devotion, and the skills that would prepare them for roles as ladies of other estates. Education was practical, steeped in the values of service, loyalty, and faith. Religious observance played a central role in castle life. Chapels were often built within the walls, and daily prayers marked the passing of time. The household gathered for mass, and the presence of chaplains and priests ensured that spiritual duties were never neglected. Festivals of the church calendar brought color and celebration, with processions, feasts, and rituals that tied castle life to the wider rhythms of the medieval world. Castles were also places of defense, and drills were part of daily existence. Soldiers practiced archery, sharpened swords, and prepared for the possibility of siege. Life within the walls during times of attack was especially harsh. Food had to be rationed, water guarded, and morale maintained. Yet even in peace, the shadow of conflict lingered, for castles were built not only to house, but also to withstand. Despite the hardships, castles could also be centers of culture. Lords and ladies patronized poets, hosted troubadours, and encouraged the arts. Stories of King Arthur, chansons of heroic deeds, and tales of romance echoed through the halls, offering escape from the routines of daily life. Music and poetry softened the stone walls, weaving a sense of wonder into the everyday. And yet, for all their grandeur, castles were not entirely comfortable places. They were often cold, drafty, and dimly lit. Rats and insects found their way into storerooms, and smoke from great hearths filled the air. Even nobles endured discomforts that modern life would find surprising. What made the castle extraordinary was not luxury, but the way it gathered people together into a shared life of duty, resilience, and tradition. As you imagine the castle at night, picture the torches dimming one by one in the great hall. The kitchens grow quiet. The guards walk their steady rounds, and in the private chambers, the household settles into rest. Outside, the stone walls rise dark against the starlit sky, a fortress of both strength and vulnerability. Inside, lives unfold, ordinary, human, and deeply connected to the rhythms of the land beyond. So as you drift deeper into sleep, let the castle's life surround you. The sound of footsteps echoing in the hall, the warmth of the hearth, the distant murmur of voices reciting evening prayers. Behind those walls, history lived and breathed, carried forward by the countless men and women who called the castle home. When we think of medieval queens, It is easy to imagine glittering crowns, lavish gowns, and grand ceremonies. Yet, beyond the symbolism, queens lived lives of immense responsibility, quiet influence, and sometimes heavy burdens. Their power was rarely expressed on the battlefield or in the council chamber, but it could be just as profound, woven into the fabric of dynasties, alliances, and courtly life. A queen was more than a consort to her husband, the king. She was the guardian of royal lineage, the visible embodiment of dignity, and often the mediator between conflicting powers. Her very presence reinforced the image of monarchy as divinely ordained and complete. To the people, the queen was a figure of grace and stability. To her family and allies, she was a living bridge between kingdoms, carrying with her the hopes of peace or the risk of conflict. Marriage was the cornerstone of a queen's role. Rarely chosen for love, these unions were political contracts, sealed to strengthen alliances, secure borders, or consolidate claims. A queen's wedding was often a grand event, filled with pageantry, processions, and solemn vows spoken before the church. Yet, behind the celebration lay the weight of duty. With marriage, a young princess might leave her homeland forever, bringing with her new customs and traditions, while adjusting to life in an unfamiliar court. The expectation to bear heirs was central to a queen's position. The birth of a son was celebrated as the assurance of dynastic continuity, while the absence of children could lead to political instability, criticism, or even annulment. Childbirth was both sacred and perilous. Queens entered the birthing chamber with prayers, blessings, and the watchful eyes of attendants. Yet the dangers were great. Some did not survive, leaving behind grieving families and realms thrown into uncertainty. The lives of queens were often shaped by this delicate balance of hope, duty, and risk. Beyond motherhood, queens wielded influence in more subtle ways. Many acted as counselors to their husbands, offering perspectives shaped by both intuition and diplomacy. In moments of crisis, a queen's voice could steady a king's judgment or urge him toward mercy. Queens often served as mediators, smoothing tensions between rival nobles or intervening to protect those accused of treason. Their influence was often most effective behind the scenes, where gentle persuasion could achieve what open command could not. The daily life of a queen was filled with ritual. She was surrounded by attendants, ladies in waiting, and clerics. Her movements often ceremonial, from dawn prayers in the chapel to evening meals in the great hall. Her presence carried meaning. Even the way she dressed communicated power. Rich fabrics, jewels, and carefully chosen colors reflected the majesty of her station. Yet beneath the layers of formality, many queens found ways to shape their households into centers of learning, piety, and culture. Some queens became patrons of the arts, supporting poets, musicians, and painters whose works enriched courtly life. Their patronage gave birth to songs of chivalry, illuminated manuscripts, and tapestries that carried forward the values of their age. Queens also took part in religious devotion, sponsoring churches, abbeys, and charitable works. Their piety set examples for the kingdom, and their names often lived on in the institutions they supported. Of course, not every queen was content to work in the shadows. Some took bold steps into politics, seizing opportunities to assert authority. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for example, commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and ruled as regent with an iron will. Empress Matilda fought for her rightful claim to the English throne in a turbulent civil war. Queens like Isabella of France or Margaret of Anjou became powerful figures in their own right, leading factions, orchestrating alliances, and even defying kings. These women showed that queenship was not always passive, but could be as forceful and determined as kingship itself. And yet, even for the most powerful queens, the crown was both blessing and burden. Public life demanded grace, diplomacy, and unceasing vigilance. Private life was often restricted, with little room for personal freedom. Some queens endured neglect, infidelity, or political betrayal. Others found solace in their children, their faith, or the arts. Their resilience was a quiet testament to strength. Strength not always recorded in chronicles, but felt in the shaping of dynasties and the preservation of kingdoms.